Welcome, my friend. Welcome to another quiet night, another journey back in time, where the busy noise of the modern world fades away, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves, the distant roll of ocean waves, and the ancient stories that still whisper through the dark. Before we begin our journey tonight into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in human history, take a deep breath, allow your mind to slow down, adjust your pillow, loosen your shoulders, pull the blanket up close, and let the heaviness of the day fall away from you. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether you are lying in bed in a quiet city, a quiet countryside, or somewhere far across the globe, take a moment to leave a comment below with your location and local time. It is a wonderful thing to know that, right now, in this very moment, thousands of us across the world are sharing this peaceful darkness together, resting our minds and getting ready to sleep. Tonight, we sail back over 400 years into the past. We are traveling across a stormy and mysterious ocean to a place wrapped in fog, dense oak trees, and deep silence. We are going to explore the complete, true story of the Lost Colony of Roanoke. It is a story filled with brave dreamers, dangerous voyages, tragic misunderstandings, desperate choices, and a mystery so deep that it has confounded historians, archaeologists, and travelers for centuries. Over 100 men, women, and children stepped off their wooden ships onto a wild, uncharted island on the coast of North America, hoping to build a new life and a new home. And then, in the blink of an eye, they disappeared into the shadows of the coastal forest, leaving behind only empty houses, rusting iron pots, overgrown footpaths, and a single word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. To truly understand what happened to these lost settlers, we must not begin on the island of Roanoke itself. We must begin far across the cold, grey Atlantic Ocean, in the crowded, bustling kingdom of 16th century England during the age of Queen Elizabeth I. The year is 1584. England in the late 16th century was a land undergoing a massive transformation. The air in cities like London was thick with wood smoke, coal dust, and the sharp scent of the River Thames. The cobblestone streets echoed with the iron-shod wheels of wooden carts, the calls of street vendors selling fish and wool, and the lively political chatter in smoky taverns. It was a time of great energy, but also a time of deep anxiety and fear. At the heart of this society was Queen Elizabeth I, a sharp-minded and proud ruler who guided her country through dangerous political waters. England was a small Protestant nation surrounded by powerful Catholic rivals. The greatest and most terrifying of these rivals was Spain. Under King Philip II, Spain had established a massive, wealthy empire in the southern half of the Americas. Spanish galleons, heavy with pure silver, gold, emeralds, and exotic spices, sailed across the oceans, making Spain the richest and most feared superpower in the world. Every year, tons of treasure flowed into the royal treasury in Madrid, funding massive armies and formidable warships. English merchants, nobles, and sailors watched this with immense envy and growing alarm. They saw Spain growing richer and stronger every single day, while England remained confined to its small island, dependent on trade with mainland Europe that could be cut off at any moment by political conflict. The people of England began to ask themselves a vital question. Was there a place in the vast, unknown lands of North America where England could plant its own flag? Could they build settlements, discover precious metals, trade with indigenous peoples, and establish a stronghold to balance the mighty power of Spain? Among the men who pondered this question, one figure stood out above all others, Sir Walter Raleigh. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes. He was handsome, ambitious, brilliant, and deeply charismatic. He was a courtier who wore fine velvet doublets, adorned with pearls and silver thread, but he was also a soldier, a poet, a historian, and a passionate believer in ocean exploration. Raleigh had captured the favour and imagination of Queen Elizabeth. He spent countless hours sitting with the Queen in her royal palaces, spreading out hand-drawn maps of the world, pointing to the blank spaces across the Atlantic Ocean and describing the grand future that awaited England across the sea. Raleigh argued that North America was not just a wild frontier, but a land of infinite potential. He believed it held vast forests of tall timber, perfect for building royal warships, fertile soil that could grow any crop imaginable, precious metals hidden deep within the earth, and a direct trade route to the riches of Asia. Most importantly, Raleigh pointed out that if England established a port in North America, English privateers, which were essentially state-sanctioned pirates, could use the harbour to launch surprise attacks on Spanish ships carrying gold back from the Caribbean. In March of 1584, Queen Elizabeth granted Walter Raleigh a royal charter. This charter was a legal document of incredible power. It granted Raleigh the official right to explore, colonize, and govern any lands in the New World that were not already claimed or occupied by a Christian ruler. The charter gave Raleigh 7 years to establish a permanent colony. If he failed within 7 years, his exclusive rights would vanish, and other English merchants could step in to take his place. Walter Raleigh knew that he was racing against time. However, as a favourite courtier, Queen Elizabeth forbade him from actually going on the dangerous ocean voyages himself. She wanted her sharp-minded advisor to stay close to her court in London, and so Raleigh had to organise, finance, and guide these historical expeditions from afar, selecting brave captains, soldiers, scientists, and navigators to sail into the unknown on his behalf. To understand the immense challenge Raleigh faced, you must imagine what the Atlantic Ocean was like to a 16th-century sailor. Crossing the ocean in the 1580s was not like taking a smooth modern cruise. It was an extraordinary journey into danger, physical hardship, and terror. Ships were made entirely of oak wood and canvas sailcloth, ranging from 60 to 200 tons in size. Tiny vessels compared to modern ocean ships. They had no engines, no modern GPS navigation, no refrigeration, and no way to communicate with the land once they sailed past the horizon. A voyage across the Atlantic typically took anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 whole months, depending entirely on the unpredictable ocean winds. Sailors lived in cramped, dark, damp quarters below deck, where the air was thick with the smells of bilge water, damp wool, animal manure, and unwashed bodies. Food consisted of salted beef and pork, hard biscuits called sea-ship biscuits that were often infested with small brown beetles, dried peas, and mouldy cheese. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels, but within weeks it turned stale, stagnant, and slimy, forcing sailors to drink weak beer or rum mixed with water instead. Diseases like scurvy, caused by a total lack of vitamin C, caused sailors' gums to bleed, their teeth to loosen, and old wounds to reopen. Sickness could sweep through a ship's crew in days, leaving barely enough healthy men to handle the ropes and steer the heavy wooden helm. And then there were the storms. The Atlantic Ocean was known for sudden, terrifying, violent gales that could hurl a small wooden ship onto huge waves, snapping wooden masts like toothpicks, tearing canvas sails to shreds, and washing men off the deck into the cold, dark ocean depths. Yet, despite these extreme dangers, men signed up for Raleigh's expeditions. They were driven by a powerful mix of curiosity, religious duty, political patriotism, and the burning desire to strike it rich in a new world. They had heard incredible rumors about the Americas, stories of lush green lands where crops grew twice as fast as in England, where rivers were full of fresh fish, where forests were filled with deer, and where native kings wore heavy strands of natural pearls around their necks. Raleigh was a meticulous planner. He did not want to send a full ship of women and children into the unknown without exploring the land first. He knew that the intelligent choice was to send a small, fast reconnaissance expedition, a scout mission, to find a safe harbor, explore the coastline, meet the indigenous people, evaluate the natural resources, and select the perfect location for a permanent English town. For this crucial first mission, Raleigh chose two experienced and trusted military captains, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow. Amadas was a young, enthusiastic captain with a sharp mind for navigation, while Barlow was a reflective man with a gift for observation and descriptive writing. They were given two small ships, the bark Raleigh and a smaller pinnace, along with a crew of experienced sailors, soldiers, and navigators. Their instructions were clear: sail across the ocean, locate a suitable northern passage, make friendly contact with any native peoples they encountered, map the coastline, and return to England with detailed reports. On April 27, 1584, as the spring sun was warming the rolling green hills of southern England, the two small ships weighed their heavy iron anchors and set sail from Plymouth Harbour. As the shoreline of England faded into the grey morning mist, the men on board looked out at the endless expanse of blue ocean ahead. They knew they were sailing into a world that no Englishman had ever settled. They were stepping into the vast unknown, beginning a dramatic chain of events that would eventually lead to high hopes, terrible struggles, mystery, and a total vanishing that still haunts our imagination today. As the ships glided across the endless blue waves, guided only by the stars, the sun, and crude iron compasses, the men settled into the quiet rhythm of the open sea. Day after day, week after week, the sky met the water in every direction. The only sounds were the creaking of the ship's wooden hull, the wind whistling through the ropes, and the rhythmic splashing of waves against the bow. The sailors kept watch from the high wooden decks, squinting at the horizon, waiting and watching for the first tiny sign of land, a floating piece of driftwood, a flock of coastal seabirds, or a change in the color of the ocean water. They did not know it yet, but thousands of miles ahead of them, hidden behind barrier islands and quiet coastal sounds, lay the lush, emerald island of Roanoke, a place that was about to be woven forever into the mysterious tapestry of human history. Listen to the gentle creaking of the wooden ship as it glides through the calm night waters. Feel the soft ocean breeze cooling the air around you. The stars shine brightly overhead, lighting the way across the silent ocean. Let your eyelids grow heavy as the ship continues its steady, peaceful journey toward the undiscovered shores of the New World. The two small English ships, the bark Raleigh and her companion pinnace, pushed further across the vast Atlantic Ocean, carried onward by the steady trade winds. Weeks turned into months as the wide blue waters stretched out endlessly to the horizon. Day after day, the crew lived in the rhythmic motion of the sea, watching the rise and fall of giant waves under the summer sun. But as the early days of July 1584 arrived, the character of the ocean began to change. The deep indigo blue of the open sea shifted into a lighter, greenish hue. The sailors on watch began to notice subtle clues floating on the water's surface, small clusters of green leaves, broken pine twigs, and bits of marsh grass carried out by coastal currents. Then came the scent. Long before any land appeared on the horizon, a rich, sweet fragrance drifted across the water to meet the ships. Arthur Barlow noted in his captain's log that the air smelled as if they were sailing through a vast, blooming garden, filled with wild flowers, sweet cedar, and damp, fertile earth. On the 4th day of July, 1584, a lookout, perched high in the wooden rigging, spotted a low line of land breaking the flat horizon. It was not the high, rocky coastline typical of Western Europe, but a delicate, sweeping barrier of golden sand dunes and green trees. The ships had reached the outer banks of present-day North Carolina. For more than 12 leagues, the English vessels coasted along the sea-facing beaches, searching for a gap in the breakers where they could safely navigate into the protected waters behind the barrier islands. They were cautious, knowing that shallow sandbars could easily ground a wooden hull and wreck a ship in minutes. Finally, they found a narrow opening, an inlet, where the ocean tides rushed into the quiet, glassy expanse of what we now know as Pamlico Sound. With great care, the sailors dropped their heavy iron anchors into the shallow, clear water. The long ocean voyage was over. The expedition had reached the shores of a land that Europeans had never settled. Captains Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, along with a small contingent of well-armed men, boarded a wooden rowboat and pulled toward the sandy shore of an island. Stepping onto the soft, white sand, they felt the quiet stillness of the coastal wilderness. Barlow offered a prayer of thanksgiving, and in the name of Queen Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh, he officially claimed the territory for the English crown. As the men explored the land around their landing site, they were stunned by the sheer, natural abundance. Towering oaks, aromatic red cedars, and ancient cypress trees grew close to the shore. But what astonished them most was the wild grapes. Vines covered the landscape in overwhelming abundance. They climbed up the trunks of massive trees, trailed across the sand dunes down to the water's edge, and hung heavy with dark, sweet fruit. Barlow wrote that in all of Europe, including the rich farmlands of France and Italy, he had never seen such a breathtaking display of wild fruit. The surrounding waters were crystal clear and teeming with aquatic life. Schools of fish darted through the shallows, while beds of oysters, clams, and crabs lined the shores of the Sound. In the surrounding woods, red cardinals, blue jays, and wild turkeys moved through the underbrush, while white-tailed deer grazed peacefully in open glades, showing little fear of the strange visitors. For 2 days, the English saw no direct sign of human inhabitants, though they spotted thin wisps of grey smoke rising above the distant tree line on the mainland. They knew they were being watched from the shadows of the forest. On the 3rd day, the quiet was broken by the steady splash of wooden paddles. A single canoe, expertly carved from the trunk of a giant cedar tree, emerged from a narrow creek and glided across the Sound toward the anchored English ships. Inside sat 3 native men. The English crew stood quietly along the ship's rail, watching the canoe approach. Captains Amadas and Barlow made peaceful gestures, holding up their open hands to show they carried no weapons. They signaled for the native visitors to come aboard. One of the 3 men stepped out of the canoe and onto the wooden deck of the English vessel without hesitation. He displayed no fear, looking around at the tall wooden masts, the canvas sails, and the strange iron fittings with calm curiosity. Arthur Barlow welcomed him warmly, offering him gifts of friendship, a bright red woolen cap, a simple shirt, a small metal dish, and a portion of cooked meat and wine. The man accepted the gifts with quiet dignity. He tried the food, examined the metal dish, and placed the red cap upon his head. He then returned to his wooden canoe, rowed a short distance away to a shallow section of the Sound, and began to fish. Within less than an hour, he had filled his canoe to the brim with fresh fish. Returning to the English ship, he divided his catch into 2 equal piles, placing them carefully on the deck as a generous gift to thank the English for their hospitality. This peaceful encounter marked the beginning of a friendly relationship between the English travelers and the native inhabitants of the coastal region. A few days later, a high-ranking leader arrived to meet the foreign visitors in person. His name was Granganimeo, and he was the brother of Wingina, the principal ruler of the Croatoan nation, a powerful Algonquian-speaking alliance of villages that inhabited the coastal islands and surrounding mainland rivers. Granganimeo arrived in formal state, accompanied by 40 of his most respected advisors and warriors. They traveled in a fleet of wooden canoes, landing gracefully on the sandy beach near the English camp. The native men were tall, strong, and well-built, with dark copper skin, dark hair styled neatly, and garments made of soft, tanned deer hides. They wore ornaments of polished shells, copper beads, and white feathers. Granganimio sat down on a woven reed mat laid out on the sand and invited Captains Amadas and Barlow to sit beside him. Though neither side could speak the other's language, they communicated effectively through hand gestures, expressions, and the exchange of goods. Granganimio touched his head and chest in a sign of peace and friendship, indicating that his people welcomed the visitors to their coastal lands. Over the next several weeks, the English sailors and the Secatan people engaged in frequent, peaceful trade. The native inhabitants were deeply fascinated by European metal items, iron hatchets, knives, metal bowls, and copper kettles, to a culture that crafted its tools from shaped stone, bone, shell, and wood. Metal was a remarkable material that maintained a sharp edge and reflected light like bright water. Arthur Barlow noted in his journal that Granganimio was especially drawn to a polished tin dish. The chief traded 20 high-quality beaver pelts for the single dish, then made a small hole in its rim and hung it around his neck as a protective shield and a symbol of high status. In return for English metal items, glass beads, and colored cloth, the native people provided the visitors with vast amounts of fresh food: venison, corn, squash, pumpkins, sweet melons, and endless supplies of fresh fish. Granganimio's wife also visited the camp, accompanied by her children and several attendants. Barlow described her as a woman of great grace and dignity, wearing long leather skirts, a band of white coral around her forehead, and long necklaces of genuine pearls that hung down to her waist. When the English captains visited her village on nearby Roanoke Island, she welcomed them with extraordinary hospitality. She instructed her attendants to wash the tired sailors' feet in warm water, dry their clothes by open fires, and serve them a magnificent meal of boiled corn, roasted meats, fish, and fresh berries inside a spacious wooden house protected by a high timber palisade. Arthur Barlow was so deeply impressed by the peace, beauty, and abundance of the region that his written reports reflected absolute enthusiasm. He described the native people as kind, gentle, loyal, and living in an uncorrupted state of nature, echoing the ancient stories of a lost paradise. However, beneath this peaceful surface lay complex political realities that the English visitors did not fully understand. The coastal territory was not an unpopulated wilderness, but a carefully managed network of distinct native communities, including the Secatan, the Chowanoke, the Weepemiok, and the Croatoan, who lived on nearby Hatteras Island. These communities shared long-standing alliances, trade networks, and historical rivalries. Chief Wingina and his brother Granganimio saw the newly arrived English not merely as trading partners, but as valuable strategic allies. The English possessed metal weapons, explosive gunpowder, and large ocean-going vessels. Wingina hoped that a formal partnership with these well-armed strangers would strengthen his nation's position against rival mainland tribes who threatened their borders. As the summer of 1584 began to wane, Captains Amadas and Barlow realized it was time to return to England. They had accomplished every goal of their mission. They had found a safe harbor behind the Barrier Islands, verified the richness of the soil and forests, established friendly relations with local leaders, and collected rich samples of natural resources. To ensure that their report to Queen Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh would be completely persuasive, the captains asked Chief Wingina for permission to bring 2 native representatives back to England with them. Wingina agreed, recognizing this as an opportunity to establish a direct diplomatic connection and learn about the distant homeland of the visitors. The 2 young men selected for the journey were Manteo and Wanchese. Manteo was a member of the Croatoan tribe from Hatteras Island. He was observant, intelligent, and deeply curious about the wider world. He viewed the English with open-minded optimism, desiring to learn their language and build a lasting bridge of cooperation between his people and the newcomers. Wanchese, on the other hand, was a proud warrior of the Croatoan tribe. He was watchful, cautious, and intensely protective of his culture and land. While he agreed to undertake the voyage, he remained watchful and skeptical, determined to observe the stranger's power, weapons, and true motivations up close. In late August 1584, the English ships raised their anchors, unfurled their sails, and turned east toward the open Atlantic. Sitting among crates of dried corn, fur pelts, and pearl ornaments were Manteo and Wanchese. As the low green ribbon of Roanoke Island slowly faded into the ocean mist, the two native men watched their homeland slip below the horizon, heading toward an entirely different world across the sea. The return voyage across the Atlantic was swift and uneventful. By mid-autumn, the ships made safe harbor in England. The news of Amadas and Barlow's successful expedition spread quickly throughout the realm, sparking widespread excitement. Arthur Barlow's detailed logbook was copied and read by nobles, merchants, and scholars. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes. Tall timber, pearls, and welcoming inhabitants captured the public imagination. Sir Walter Raleigh was thrilled. He brought Manteo and Wanchese to his grand residence at Durham House in London. Dressed in fine English tailored clothing, the two visitors adapted quickly to their new surroundings. They began learning the English language, worked alongside the young scholar Thomas Harriot to help him decipher their Algonquian language, and were formally presented to high-ranking lords and ladies at court. Queen Elizabeth was delighted with the results of the mission. In honor of her status as the Virgin Queen, she officially named the vast, unexplored territory of North America Virginia. As a mark of royal favor, she knighted Walter Raleigh, granting Sir Walter full royal backing to organize a large military fleet to establish the first permanent English settlement on Roanoke Island. Sir Walter Raleigh had achieved a historic triumph. He had secured the Queen's support, proved the value of his vision, and captivated the imagination of his country. But as the cold winter winds blew over the timber roofs of London, preparing the way for the grand 1585 colony, quiet warnings went unheeded. The glowing, idealized descriptions written by Barlow had painted a picture of an effortless paradise. They had made light of unpredictable sea storms, shallow harbors, the difficulty of clearing land for agriculture, and the delicate nature of native diplomacy. Soon, hundreds of English soldiers and artisans would sail back across the Atlantic Ocean, not to explore, but to build, fortify, and establish control. Among them would be military commanders trained in battle, equipped with heavy armor and iron weapons, with little understanding of the quiet balance needed to maintain peace in a delicate new world. Listen to the calm, steady rhythm of the tide pulling gently away from the shore. The dark coastal waters reflect the quiet light of the moon, casting long, peaceful shadows over the trees and sand. Allow your mind to rest in this stillness, drifting into a quiet, unbroken sleep as the night deepens around you. By the early months of 1585, the harbour town of Plymouth in southern England was filled with intense activity. Ships bobbed on the grey coastal waters as heavy wooden crates of supplies, gunpowder, iron tools, and dried provisions were loaded into their dark holds. Sir Walter Raleigh's dream of an English empire across the sea was no longer just a collection of map drawings and courtly tales. It was becoming a physical reality. 7 ships gathered under the grey spring sky, preparing to take more than 500 men across the stormy Atlantic to build the first permanent English settlement on the distant shores of Roanoke Island. Unlike the small scout mission sent the year before, this expedition was distinctly military in nature. Over 100 of the men on board were seasoned soldiers, veterans of hard-fought European wars in Ireland and the Netherlands. They were men trained to build defensive walls, enforce strict military discipline, and fight battles with iron swords and heavy matchlock muskets. They were not farmers, civilian craftsmen, or families looking to plant quiet roots in new soil. They were a military unit sent to establish a secure fortress and guard England's new frontier. To command this large enterprise, Sir Walter Raleigh chose his own cousin, Sir Richard Grenville. Grenville was a high-ranking naval officer known throughout England for his fierce pride, iron determination, and uncompromising temper. He was a commander who demanded absolute obedience from his men and tolerated no opposition from allies or enemies alike. Working directly alongside Grenville was Ralph Lane, appointed as the governor of the land settlement. Lane was another veteran soldier, a hard-nosed military officer who viewed the world through the cold, cautious lens of tactical defense and force. Also sailing with the fleet were two men of a very different character. Thomas Harriot, a brilliant young mathematician and astronomer who aimed to map the new territory and study its natural resources, and John White, a talented artist whose delicate watercolor sketches would document the plant life, wildlife, and native communities of the region. Returning with them on the flagship were Manteo and Wanchese, the two native men who had spent the past winter living in London. On April 9, 1585, the fleet untied its heavy ropes and raised its canvas sails, moving out of Plymouth Harbour into the open ocean. But right from the very beginning, this grand voyage was met with severe misfortune. While crossing the Atlantic, a sudden, violent storm tore through the fleet. Dark storm clouds swallowed the sun, and towering waves slammed against the wooden hulls. The fierce winds scattered the 7 ships across miles of open ocean, separating them from one another in the blinding rain. The primary flagship, carrying Sir Richard Grenville, lost its small auxiliary boat and barely survived the tempest. When Grenville's vessel finally reached the Outer Banks in late June, only a few ships from the scattered fleet had managed to find the designated meeting place. Worse still, as Grenville's heavy flagship attempted to navigate the shallow, treacherous inlet near Ocracoke, it struck a hidden sandbar with a violent, grinding shudder. The heavy impact cracked the wooden timbers of the ship's bottom. Ocean water poured into the dark storage holds, soaking and destroying the vast majority of the colony's vital food supplies. Burlap sacks of wheat flour, barrels of salted meat, farm seeds intended for spring planting, and precious stores of dry gunpowder were ruined by salty seawater within hours. Before the settlers had even set foot on Roanoke Island, most of their food provisions for the upcoming winter were completely lost. This disaster created an immediate atmosphere of tension and desperation. Sir Richard Grenville was furious, deeply stressed by the realization that his men were now facing a severe survival crisis before their work had even begun. In July of 1585, while waiting for the remaining ships to arrive, Grenville decided to lead a well-armed expedition of boat crews to explore the mainland rivers and villages surrounding Pamlico Sound. He brought along Ralph Lane, a squad of armed soldiers, and the 2 native guides, Manteo and Wanchese. During this week-long journey, the English visited several indigenous settlements, including a village named Aquascogok. While the English were visiting Aquascogok, a small silver drinking cup belonging to Grenville went missing from his personal items. Grenville believed that one of the native villagers had stolen the cup. Rather than letting the minor loss go or resolving the issue through careful, quiet diplomacy, Grenville lost his temper. He demanded the immediate return of the silver item. When the village leaders could not produce the cup, Grenville ordered his soldiers to take harsh, destructive revenge. The English soldiers marched back into the village, set fire to the thatched wooden homes, and completely destroyed the native people's standing corn crops just as they were ripening for the upcoming harvest. This single act of military violence broke the peaceful trust that Arthur Barlow had worked so hard to build the previous year. It demonstrated to the indigenous inhabitants that these foreign visitors possessed dangerous weapons and were willing to destroy entire communities over a minor piece of metal. Observing this entire event from among the English soldiers was Wanchese. As he watched the fire swallow the homes and food supplies of fellow native people, any remaining respect he had for the English vanished entirely. He realized that these strangers had not come to share the land in peace. They had come to dominate it by force. Shortly after the expedition returned to the coastal camp, Wanchese slipped quietly into the forest, leaving the English forever to rejoin his people and warn them of the danger in their midst. Manteo, however, made a different choice. He chose to remain with the English, acting as an interpreter and guide, trying desperately to maintain a thin bridge of communication between his native countrymen and his new companions. By late summer, the English fleet anchored near the northern end of Roanoke Island. Sir Richard Grenville decided it was time for him to sail back to England to report to Sir Walter Raleigh and collect fresh food supplies. He left Governor Ralph Lane in charge of a remaining garrison of 107 men. Every single person left behind was a man, mostly soldiers and military guards. There were no women or children in this 1585 group. It was strictly an armed outpost. Ralph Lane set his soldiers to work, clearing dense oak trees on the northern point of Roanoke Island. They dug dirt trenches, built earthen banks, and erected a defensive fortification named Fort Raleigh alongside a cluster of simple timber houses. At first, Chief Wingina and the Secatan people allowed the English to stay on the island. Wingina even took the new name Pemisapan, a traditional title marking his authority during this critical period. Out of respect and strategic patience, Pemisapan instructed his people to share their remaining food supplies with the garrison, showing them how to construct woven reed fish traps in the Sound and where to gather wild edible roots. But as autumn turned into winter, the situation inside Fort Raleigh became increasingly desperate. The English garrison consisted of soldiers, not experienced farmers. Having lost their primary provisions in the shipwreck, they were completely dependent on Pemisapan's people for their daily meals. Winter descended on the Outer Banks. Warm sea breezes were replaced by freezing, biting winds that whistled through the gaps in the timber cabins. Frost covered the marsh grass, and food became dangerously scarce for everyone on the island. Pemisapan's people were facing their own winter food shortages as their stored corn was limited. They could no longer afford to feed over 100 hungry English soldiers who had little of value to offer in return. Furthermore, a dark and terrifying shadow had fallen over the indigenous settlements. Shortly after the English arrived, a silent, deadly illness began spreading through the native villages. Men, women, and children who had been healthy suddenly developed high fevers, painful coughs, and dark spots on their skin. Within days, hundreds of people were dying in every community. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes of European diseases such as smallpox and influenza, to which the native populations had no natural immunity. Because the English soldiers themselves did not fall ill from these invisible germs, the native people came to believe that the foreigners possessed dark magic. They believed the English could summon invisible spirits to strike down their villages from a distance without ever raising a bow or sword. Fear and deep resentment spread among the indigenous councils. Pemisapan watched his family members, respected elders, and strongest warriors perish from this mysterious sickness. His attitude toward the English hardened. He saw Ralph Lane and his garrison not as potential trade partners, but as dangerous, disease-bearing invaders who threatened the survival of his people. By the spring of 1586, Pemisapan decided to break off relations with Fort Raleigh. He ordered his people to dismantle their fish traps, abandon their seasonal camps on Roanoke Island, and refuse any further trade of corn or game with the English. Governor Ralph Lane panicked. His soldiers were starving, reduced to eating wild roots, pine bark, and their own boiled guard dogs to survive. Lane's military mindset convinced him that an attack was imminent. He believed Pemisapan was building a coalition of mainland tribes to launch a massive night assault on Fort Raleigh to destroy the garrison completely. Rather than waiting for an attack, Ralph Lane determined to strike first with decisive, lethal force. On June 1, 1586, Governor Lane led a heavily armed squad of soldiers across the Sound to the mainland village where Chief Pemisapan was staying. Lane asked for a peaceful meeting with the chief, claiming he wished to negotiate for food supplies. Pemisapan, not expecting an immediate military strike, agreed to meet. As the native chief and his councillors stepped out to speak with the English officers, Ralph Lane suddenly gave a pre-arranged battle cry, "Christ our defender." At that signal, the English soldiers drew their muskets and iron swords, opening fire on the unarmed native leaders. Pemisapan was wounded in the initial volley, but managed to leap up and run into the surrounding forest. An English soldier gave chase into the dense brush. A short time later, the soldier emerged from the woods carrying Pemisapan's head, holding it up as a grim warning to all who witnessed it. Ralph Lane had won the brief skirmish, but he had destroyed any hope of long-term peace. By killing Chief Pemisapan, the primary leader of the Secatan nation, the English had created permanent enemies of every native village in the region. The garrison was now isolated, surrounded by hostile territory, completely out of food, and waiting in constant fear of a massive retaliatory strike. Then, just 1 week after the death of Chief Pemisapan, lookouts at Fort Raleigh spotted a magnificent sight on the sea horizon. On June 8, 1586, a fleet of giant ships approached the Barrier Islands. It was not Sir Richard Grenville returning from England, nor was it a native war fleet. It was the fleet of Sir Francis Drake, the most famous English sea captain and privateer of the era. Drake had been raiding Spanish ports in the Caribbean and decided to stop at Roanoke Island to check on the progress of the new colony. When Drake landed, he was shocked by the poor condition of the garrison. The men were starving, weak, dressed in worn garments, and living under constant military stress. Drake offered generous assistance. He offered to give Lane a sturdy wooden ship, several supply pinnaces, and months of provisions so the garrison could continue its mission. Lane gratefully accepted. However, just as the supply boats were being loaded, a severe Atlantic hurricane hit the coast. For 3 terrifying days, roaring winds, blinding rain, and gigantic waves battered the Barrier Islands. The supply ship that Drake had assigned to Lane was dragged out to sea by the storm currents and lost, along with most of the newly arrived provisions. That storm broke the resolve of Ralph Lane and his men. Exhausted by hunger, cold, disease, and war, they felt the environment itself was rejecting their presence. The soldiers begged Governor Lane to abandon the fort and accept Sir Francis Drake's offer to carry them back home to England. Lane agreed. On June 19, 1586, the garrison boarded Drake's ships in a chaotic rush, abandoning Fort Raleigh. In their haste to leave, they left behind heavy iron equipment, scientific records, personal items, and 3 English soldiers who were away exploring the mainland and were left behind in the rapid departure. The military colony of 1585 had ended in complete failure. The ships unfurled their sails and vanished across the ocean, leaving Roanoke Island silent, deserted, and scarred by conflict. Listen to the calm rustle of wind through the coastal leaves. The ocean waves lap softly against the dark sand, smoothing away the footprints of the soldiers who fled into the night. Everything is peaceful now. Let your breathing remain deep, slow, and steady, drifting into a quiet, unbroken slumber as the story rests in the calm shadows of time. Just a few short weeks after Sir Francis Drake's ships vanished over the eastern horizon, carrying Ralph Lane's starving soldiers back to England, the quiet waters of the Outer Banks were broken once again by the heavy splash of iron anchors. Sir Richard Grenville had finally returned. Crossing the ocean from London, Grenville's fleet was loaded with the long-promised supply barrels, fresh gunpowder, farming tools, and hundreds of enthusiastic new recruits. He had envisioned arriving at a thriving, well-fortified English outpost on Roanoke Island. He expected to be greeted by Governor Ralph Lane, to see smoke rising peacefully from timber chimneys, and to review a disciplined line of English guards standing proudly at the gates of Fort Raleigh. Instead, as Grenville's landing boats pulled up onto the white sandy beach of Roanoke, an eerie, heavy silence hung over the island. The tall wooden gates of Fort Raleigh were standing wide open, swinging slowly in the damp ocean breeze. The dirt pathways between the timber cabins were overgrown with tall, wild weeds, thick briars, and green, crawling vines. Inside the cabins, tables were overturned, cold ash lay scattered across long-abandoned stone hearths, and rusty iron pots sat empty on the wooden floors. There were no English soldiers marching on the parade grounds. There were no friendly signals from the watchtower. There was only the endless rustle of oak leaves, the call of lone seabirds, and the quiet, rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore. Sir Richard Grenville walked slowly through the abandoned settlement, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards of the empty houses. He was thoroughly confused and deeply frustrated. He searched the perimeter of the fort, looking for written notes, carved messages, or any physical clue that might explain why over 100 well-armed men had completely deserted their post. But Ralph Lane and his garrison had fled in such a chaotic, hasty panic during the Atlantic hurricane with Sir Francis Drake that they had left behind no official record for their returning commander. While searching the nearby mainland shores, Grenville's men made a grim and chilling discovery. They found the cold, unburied body of one of the 3 English soldiers who had been left behind during Lane's rushed evacuation. The man had been slain by native wooden arrows and iron blades, his body left beneath the shade of tall pine trees. It was a stark, terrifying reminder that the peace between the English and the local native tribes was entirely shattered. The Secotàn people, still mourning the treacherous murder of their chief, Pemisapan, were actively hunting any Englishman who dared step onto their land. Sir Richard Grenville found himself in an extremely difficult military predicament. He had a fleet of ships loaded with valuable supplies, but he could not leave a massive civilian colony on an island surrounded by hostile forces without proper organization. Yet, at the same time, Grenville knew he could not simply sail back to England and leave Roanoke Island entirely vacant. Under the terms of Sir Walter Raleigh's royal charter from Queen Elizabeth, if the English abandoned their physical presence in North America for too long, their legal land claims would expire, opening the door for Spain or rival European powers to swoop in and claim the territory for themselves. Grenville needed a solution, a temporary placeholder to hold the land for the English crown until a larger, better-planned settlement could be organized from London. He decided to establish a small, isolated military garrison. Grenville selected 15 brave, highly disciplined soldiers from his fleet. Some historical accounts suggest the number may have been slightly higher, perhaps 18 men, but in the popular memory and records of the time, they became known as the Solitary 15. Grenville provided these 15 men with generous provisions. He stocked their storehouses with 2 full years' worth of salted meat, dried peas, flour, wine, and fresh water. He equipped them with matchlock muskets, iron armor, swords, axes, and plenty of gunpowder. Their instructions were clear and straightforward. They were to repair the damaged wooden houses of Fort Raleigh, maintain a vigilant day and night watch from the wooden guard towers, stay close to the fort's defenses, avoid unnecessary conflict with the local native tribes, and wait patiently for the arrival of a new English fleet. The leader appointed to command this small garrison was a trusted officer who assured Grenville that his men would hold the fort at all costs. As the autumn of 1586 approached, Sir Richard Grenville boarded his flagship, raised his canvas sails, and weighed anchor. The 15 soldiers stood along the sandy shoreline, watching the giant English ships shrink smaller and smaller against the wide expanse of the blue ocean, until at last the sails dipped below the horizon, leaving them completely alone. Imagine the profound, crushing isolation those 15 men must have felt as the last English ship disappeared. They were 15 souls standing on the edge of a vast, unexplored continent of dense forests, unpredictable swamps, and unfamiliar rivers. Behind them lay thousands of miles of deep, unforgiving ocean, separating them from their families, their homes, and everything they had ever known. Ahead of them lay an uncertain wilderness inhabited by indigenous nations who viewed them with deep suspicion and anger. For the first few weeks, the quiet rhythm of life on Roanoke Island was peaceful. The 15 soldiers set to work repairing the wooden palisade walls of Fort Raleigh. They chopped down fresh timber, patched the roofs of the timber houses, cleaned out the water wells, and set up a organized daily routine of guard rotations. During the day, they kept watch from the high wooden platform, looking out across the calm waters of the Sound for any signs of approaching canoes. At night, they gathered around open wood fires inside the fort, listening to the strange, unfamiliar sounds of the night forest, the hooting of owls, the howling of red wolves, and the wind whistling through the high canopy of live oaks. They believed they were safe inside their fortified wooden walls. They trusted in their heavy iron weapons, their gunpowder, and their thick wooden defenses, but they failed to realize that they were being carefully observed from the shadows of the woods every single day. Wanchese, the Secotàn warrior who had traveled to London and later fled into the forest, was watching them. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of the English soldiers better than anyone. He knew that while their iron muskets were loud and deadly at a distance, they were slow and clumsy to reload, requiring dry gunpowder and lighted matches that could easily be put out by rain or wind. He also knew that 15 men, no matter how well armed, could not defend every side of Fort Raleigh if they were drawn out into the open. The local native tribes, led by remaining Secotàn warriors and allies from the mainland, decided that this small garrison of 15 men could not be allowed to remain. To the indigenous people, these soldiers represented the same foreign group that had burned their crops, brought mysterious fatal diseases to their children, and murdered their chief, Pemisapan. The exact details of what happened to the solitary 15 were lost for a long time, hidden in the silent shadows of history. But years later, when native informants finally spoke to English searchers, the dramatic and tragic story of their final hours was revealed. It began on a calm, misty morning. 2 native men walked out from the edge of the forest toward the open gates of Fort Raleigh, holding up their hands to show they were unarmed. They indicated through simple hand gestures that they wished to trade fresh meat and fish for English copper items. The English garrison, eager for fresh food and tired of eating salty preserved meats from wooden barrels, lowered their guard. The commander allowed 2 of his soldiers to step outside the wooden fort gates, unarmed and carrying small items for trade. It was a clever, lethal trap. As soon as the 2 English soldiers stepped away from the protection of the fort walls, dozens of native warriors sprang out from hiding places in the tall grass and dense pine brush. Before the 2 soldiers could run back to the gate, they were struck down by a rain of fast-moving wooden arrows. 1 English soldier died instantly on the dirt path, while the second managed to run back into the fort, bleeding heavily. Immediately, the native warriors rushed forward, surrounding Fort Raleigh on all sides. They did not attempt to scale the high wooden walls directly against the English musket fire. Instead, they used fire as a weapon. They shot flaming arrows tipped with burning pine pitch onto the dry wooden roofs of the timber cabins inside the fort. Within minutes, thick black smoke began pouring into the sky. Flames licked across the dry pine shingles, quickly spreading from house to house. The interior of Fort Raleigh became an inescapable inferno of heat and choking smoke. The English soldiers were forced to make a desperate choice: stay inside and be consumed by the roaring flames, or sprint out through the wooden gates into the open air where the native warriors waited. Grabbing their iron swords, heavy helmets and muskets, the surviving garrison broke through the gates in a desperate attempt to reach the water. A fierce, chaotic battle broke out along the dirt pathways leading to the shore. The air was filled with the deafening cracks of musket fire, the whistle of flying arrows, the clashing of iron blades against wooden shields, and the terrifying screams of fighting men. During the chaotic melee, the garrison's commander was killed, along with several other soldiers. The surviving Englishmen fought with absolute desperation, stepping backward toward the edge of the sound where their small wooden boat was tied to a wooden stake. Reaching the water's edge, the remaining handful of bleeding, exhausted soldiers leaped into the small boat, untied the rope, and pushed hard away from the shore. They rowed with all their remaining strength, pulling out into the open water of the Sound as arrows splashed harmlessly into the waves around them. Looking back at Roanoke Island, they watched in horror as thick plumes of grey smoke rose above the tree line. Fort Raleigh, the wooden symbol of English authority in the New World, was burning to the ground, consumed by crackling flames. The surviving soldiers rowed their small boat across the Sound, seeking refuge on a small, uninhabited islet near the ocean inlet. There, on that lonely strip of sand, they tended to their wounds, gathered their thoughts, and tried to decide what to do next. They had lost their fort, their primary food supplies, their armor, and their commander. They were completely exposed to the elements and surrounded by hostile shores. According to later native accounts, the few survivors eventually left their small sand islet, rowing their boat along the coast in search of safety. They were never seen by English eyes again. Whether their small boat was overturned by a sudden ocean wave, or whether they were captured by mainland tribes as they searched for fresh water, their ultimate fate dissolved into total mystery. When the sun set over Roanoke Island that evening, the burning embers of Fort Raleigh slowly faded into cold, grey ash. The quiet forest reclaimed the clearing. The tall oaks and pine trees stood silent guard over the ruined fort, while the ocean waves washed away the footprints of the battle along the shore. The initial military strategy to colonize North America had ended in complete, tragic disaster. First, Ralph Lane's garrison had fled in panic with Sir Francis Drake. Now, Sir Richard Grenville's solitary garrison of 15 men had been overwhelmed, killed, or driven into the unknown wilderness. Back in London, Sir Walter Raleigh was beginning to realize that sending rough, quick-tempered soldiers to conquer a new land by military force was a fundamental mistake. If England was to ever build a successful, lasting community across the ocean, it could not be a military fort built on fear, violence, and iron swords. It needed to be something entirely different. It needed to be a true community, a settlement of families, farmers, carpenters, women, and children who would clear the fields, plant crops, raise livestock, and build real homes intended to last for generations. Even as the ashes of Fort Raleigh grew cold under the winter stars, plans were already being drawn up in the smoky parlours of London for a new kind of expedition. A group of brave men and women were stepping forward, willing to risk everything they owned to cross the dark Atlantic Ocean and build a new life in a place they called the City of Raleigh. Listen to the calm, soothing sound of the night wind as it whispers through the dark pine trees. The quiet water laps gently against the sandy shore, bringing peace and stillness to the ancient island. Let your body sink deeper into complete relaxation, allowing your mind to drift peacefully into a deep, uninterrupted sleep as the night settles around you. The cold winter months of early 1587 brought a quiet, reflective mood to the busy streets of London. Inside the warm, wood-panelled rooms of Sir Walter Raleigh's estate, candle wax dripped slowly onto large paper maps spread across long oak tables. Raleigh was a man who learned quickly from his failures. He sat by the fire, studying the reports of the past 3 years, analysing every mistake made by Sir Richard Grenville and Governor Ralph Lane. He recognised that sending rough, quick-tempered soldiers to build a military fort had been a fundamental flaw. Soldiers were trained for war, not for clearing rocky soil, planting cornfields, building wooden furniture, or establishing long-term community relationships. When food ran short, soldiers used iron swords and gunpowder rather than patience and diplomacy. Their actions had turned the local native populations from curious, hospitable hosts into bitter, watchful enemies. If England was going to build a lasting presence in the New World, it could not be a cold, lonely fortress full of armed guards. It had to be a true human community, a settlement of families. It needed men who knew how to farm, construct timber frames, make leather boots, and forge metal tools, alongside women who could manage households, raise children, and build a real society. They needed people who were not looking for quick gold or easy military glory, but who were looking for a place to call home forever. Raleigh envisioned a brand new colony, a self-governing civilian settlement to be named officially as the City of Raleigh. To ensure the new settlement had the best chance of survival, Raleigh decided to change the location entirely. He knew that the barrier islands around Roanoke had proven dangerous, with shallow ocean inlets, unpredictable sandbars, and deep political conflicts with the local Croatoan nation. Instead, Raleigh selected the rich, fertile shores of the Chesapeake Bay, located further north. The Chesapeake region offered deep-water harbors suitable for heavy sea ships, fertile soil for growing crops, and access to fresh river systems leading inland. To lead this new, ambitious venture, Sir Walter Raleigh selected a man whose character was completely different from the rough, aggressive military commanders of the previous expeditions, John White. John White was a gentleman, a talented artist, a cartographer, and an educated scholar. He had participated in the earlier voyages to Roanoke, spending months exploring the woods, drawing detailed maps, and painting exquisite, accurate watercolors of the local plant life, wildlife, and indigenous communities. White was a gentle, observant man who understood the value of peace, patience, and clear diplomacy. He possessed a genuine respect for the native peoples of North America and believed that mutual trade, fair treatment, and respect were the true keys to a successful colony. Most importantly, John White was not just leading this expedition as an hired officer, he was investing his entire personal life and family into the dream. Joining Governor John White on this dangerous ocean voyage was his pregnant daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare, a skilled tilemaker and bricklayer. White was bringing his own flesh and blood across the wide, unpredictable ocean to build a future in the New World. During the cold winter of 1586 and early 1587, Governor John White travelled throughout the English countryside, recruiting brave men and women to join the enterprise. The proposition was simple yet profound. In exchange for their courage and labour, Sir Walter Raleigh offered each settler at least 500 acres of land in the new city of Raleigh, along with a direct voice in the colony's local government council. To ordinary English tenant farmers, carpenters, tailors, and blacksmiths who owned no land of their own and struggled under high rents in England, this offer was an incredible opportunity. It offered a chance to escape poverty, build a family estate, and own vast land they could pass down to their children. By April 1587, a group of 117 settlers had gathered at the port of Portsmouth, ready to set sail. This group was fundamentally different from any European expedition previously sent to North America. Among the 117 colonists were 89 men, 17 brave women, several of whom were heavily pregnant, and 11 young children. They brought with them everything necessary to build a complete English village from scratch: crates of iron nails, saw blades, axes, hammers, weaving looms, seeds for planting corn and wheat, farm tools, kitchen cookware, personal clothes, family Bibles, and domestic livestock including pigs, chickens, and guard dogs. Also standing along the wooden dock, preparing to board the ships once again, was Manteo. The native Croatoan man had remained a loyal, dedicated friend to the English, acting as a vital cultural ambassador. He was eager to return to his home island of Hatteras to see his mother and his people, hoping to help Governor White establish permanent peace across the region. On May 8, 1587, the expedition untied its heavy ropes and raised its canvas sails. The fleet consisted of 3 vessels: a large, 3-masted sea ship named the Lion, a smaller armed pinnace, and a light supply flyboat. As the green hills of England faded into the spring ocean mist, the 117 men, women, and children stood along the wooden rails, looking out over the blue water with a mixture of quiet fear and high hope. The voyage across the Atlantic in 1587 was long, exhausting, and filled with physical hardship. Families were crowded into small, damp wooden compartments below deck, where the ceiling beams were so low that grown men had to stoop. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, sea salt, timber tar, and unwashed bodies. Small children cried as the ships rolled violently over giant ocean swells, while mothers did their best to comfort them in the dark, swaying holds. Fresh water was rationed carefully, and daily meals consisted of dry sea biscuits, salty preserved beef, and hard cheese. Despite the crowded conditions, a strong sense of unity and shared purpose developed among the families. They gathered in the evenings below deck, singing traditional songs, reading passages from scripture, and discussing their dreams for the homes, gardens, and farmlands they would construct along the peaceful shores of the Chesapeake Bay. However, dark conflict was brewing within the leadership of the fleet. To command the ships during the sea voyage, Sir Walter Raleigh had hired a veteran Portuguese navigator named Simon Fernandes. Fernandes was an experienced, hardened sea pilot who had spent years sailing the dangerous waters of the West Indies as a privateer. He was a coarse, impatient, rough-tempered man who held little respect for civilian settlers, women, or children. He viewed the entire expedition not as a noble civilizing mission, but as a tedious, unprofitable chore that was keeping him from his true passion: hunting and capturing wealthy Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean Sea. From the very beginning of the voyage, Governor John White and pilot Simon Fernandes clashed bitterly over authority, route decisions, and daily schedules. Fernandes repeatedly made unilateral choices that put the settlers in severe danger. While stopping in the Caribbean islands of Santa Cruz and Puerto Rico to collect fresh water, fruit, and salt, Fernandes refused to allow the settlers to land in safe areas, rushing them back onto the ships and preventing Governor White from gathering vital fruit trees, cattle, and plants intended for the new settlement. In one instance, Fernandes intentionally left a small group of English gatherers stranded on an island shore for days without fresh water, only bringing them back aboard after Governor White threatened legal prosecution upon their return to England. By mid-July 1587, after more than 2 months at sea, the 3 ships finally made landfall along the outer banks of Virginia. According to Sir Walter Raleigh's strict written instructions, the fleet was not supposed to settle on Roanoke Island. Their clear orders were to make a brief temporary stop at Roanoke Island, find the solitary 15 soldiers left behind by Sir Richard Grenville the year before, check on their welfare, give them fresh supplies, and then immediately board the ships again to sail further north into the deep, safe harbor of the Chesapeake Bay to establish the true city of Raleigh. On July 22, 1587, Governor John White, along with a small crew of 40 well-armed men, boarded a small wooden boat to row ashore to Roanoke Island to search for the 15 soldiers. Just as John White was stepping into the rowboat, pilot Simon Fernandez committed an act of unbelievable betrayal that changed the fate of the colony forever. Fernandez stood along the ship's rail and shouted down to the sailors in the rowboat, announcing firmly that the summer season was far spent and that he would not permit a single settler to reboard his ships once they stepped foot on Roanoke Island. He claimed that he needed to return to England immediately to avoid winter storms, and that he refused to waste any more time sailing north to the Chesapeake Bay. He ordered his sailors to unload all the settlers' heavy luggage, wooden crates, farming tools, and personal belongings directly onto the sandy beaches of Roanoke, leaving them stranded on the small island. Governor John White was stunned, furious, and utterly desperate. He argued, pleaded, and reminded Fernandez of Sir Walter Raleigh's royal orders and the Queen's royal charter. But Fernandez held complete physical control over the heavy sea ships and the crew. White was faced with a terrifying, impossible choice. He could stand on the deck and fight a violent battle against the ship's armed crew, or he could step ashore onto Roanoke Island to protect his pregnant daughter, his family, and the 117 settlers who were being forcibly landed on an isolated beach. With a heavy heart, Governor John White stepped out of the boat and onto the soft sand of Roanoke Island. The dream of reaching the safe, deep waters of the Chesapeake Bay was shattered in a single moment. The 117 men, women, and children were left standing on the edge of the wild coastal forest, trapped on the exact same small island where 2 previous English expeditions had ended in violence, hunger, disease, and war. The air was warm, damp, and heavy, with the scent of salt marsh and pine resin. As the sun began to sink below the western tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the sandy dunes, the settlers gathered their wooden crates, small children, and personal items together along the shore. They looked around at the towering oak trees, listening to the quiet, unfamiliar sounds of the coastal forest. They knew that somewhere in the dark woods beyond the beach lay the ruins of Fort Raleigh, and somewhere in the surrounding waters lived native tribes who had every reason to hate the sound of the English language. Yet, despite the sudden betrayal and terrifying uncertainty, Governor John White stood among his people, offering words of encouragement, courage, and hope. They were 117 strong. They had brave hearts, skilled hands, loving families, and the firm determination to build a community that would endure. Listen to the soft, rhythmic lapping of the gentle waves against the quiet, dark shoreline. The ocean breeze moves peacefully through the tall pine branches overhead, singing a soft, timeless lullaby under a brilliant canopy of quiet stars. Let your body sink into complete, effortless rest, drifting peacefully into a deep, unbroken sleep as the night enfolds you in total calm. The morning sun of late July 1587 rose warm and bright over the glassy waters of Pamlico Sound, burning away the low white sea fog that hung over the coastal marshes. On the northern shores of Roanoke Island, 117 men, women, and children stood surrounded by their wooden chests, barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, and iron tools. The heavy sea ships commanded by Simon Fernandez remained anchored in the deeper blue waters far off the coast, their dark wooden silhouettes standing like silent watchmen against the horizon. Governor John White knew there was no time to sit in despair over the pilot's bitter betrayal. His immediate duty was to secure his people, find shelter for the pregnant women and small children, and locate the 15 soldiers left behind by Sir Richard Grenville the previous year. Gathering a squad of well-armed men, including his son-in-law Ananias Dare and the loyal native guide Manteo, Governor White marched carefully along the familiar sandy path leading through the dense pine woods toward the site of Fort Raleigh. The forest was heavy with the humid summer heat, silent save for the sharp calls of blue jays and the steady buzzing of cicadas high in the oak canopy. As the trees cleared into the open space where Fort Raleigh had been built 2 years earlier, a chilling scene greeted the English group. The earthen walls of the fort had crumbled into smooth dirt mounds, washed away by autumn rains and winter storms. The heavy wooden palisade gates were fallen and rotting in the tall grass. But the most unsettling discovery was the complete absence of human life. John White walked slowly into the clearing, searching for the 15 soldiers. What he found instead were the charred, blackened ruins of the timber houses built during Ralph Lane's garrison. The roofs had caved in, consumed by fire months before, leaving only burnt wooden posts pointing toward the sky like dark, broken fingers. Thick wild briars, green melon vines, and tall weeds had grown up through the floorboards of the ruined homes, completely choking the doorways and pathways. While searching through the overgrown brush near the fort perimeter, one of White's men stepped on something hard hidden beneath the tall weeds. Clearing away the vines, the men looked down in horror. Lying in the dark soil were the bleached white bones of a human skeleton, pick-cleaned by wild forest animals and weathered by the elements. It was the unburied remains of one of the 15 soldiers left behind by Grenville. Searching the rest of the ruined settlement and the surrounding woods, White found no other survivors, no hidden messages, and no sign of the remaining 14 men. The iron tools, gunpowder barrels, and food supplies that Grenville had stocked inside the fort were entirely gone, looted or burned during the attack. The reality was painfully clear to Governor White and Manteo. The native tribes had attacked the small garrison, burned Fort Raleigh to the ground, and killed or driven the surviving soldiers into the ocean. The peace between the English and the indigenous inhabitants was not merely broken, it was completely destroyed by a legacy of war, fire, and blood. Despite the grim discovery, John White knew he had no choice but to make the best of their dire location. Simon Fernandez had flatly refused to take the colony anywhere else. Roanoke Island was where they had to make their stand. Governor White ordered his men to clear away the weeds, vines, and charred debris from the ruined settlement site. Over the next several weeks, the quiet island echoed with the rhythmic sounds of heavy axes chopping fresh pine timber, hammers driving iron nails into wooden frames, and saws slicing through planks. The settlers set to work repairing the surviving timber houses, building sturdy new wooden homes with pitched roofs, and constructing a high, strong timber palisade fence around the perimeter of their new village to protect their families from surprise attacks. While the men cleared land, built homes, and dug fresh water wells, the women set up household kitchens, washed clothes in the quiet waters of the Sound, and tended to the young children. Children's laughter rang out through the pine woods, smoke rose peacefully from stone chimneys, and small vegetable gardens were cleared in the rich forest soil. Yet, beneath this industrious atmosphere, a constant sense of fear and tension hung over the community. The settlers knew they were being watched from the dark shadows of the surrounding woods. Governor White was deeply committed to avoiding the brutal mistakes of previous military leaders. He did not want war. He knew that a civilian colony containing women and children could not survive in an atmosphere of constant conflict. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes, mutual trust, and diplomatic friendship with the surrounding native nations. To achieve this, White relied on Manteo. On July 28, 1587, Governor White and a small group of settlers accompanied Manteo on a boat journey south to his home island of Croatoan, present-day Hatteras Island. When the English boat pulled up to the sandy shores of Croatoan, the native inhabitants at first ran into the forest, picking up their wooden bows and spears. fearing that the visitors were soldiers coming to burn their homes like Grenville had done. But Manteo stepped onto the beach alone, calling out in his native language, calling his people by name, and explaining that the new English governor had come in peace, bringing gifts, trade, and friendship. Recognizing Manteo's voice, the Croatan people emerged from the tree line with joyful shouts. Manteo was warmly reunited with his mother, who was a high-ranking leader of the tribe, and his family. The Croatan people welcomed Governor White into their village, sharing a feast of fresh fish, corn, and wild fruit. During the feast, Governor White held a formal diplomatic council with the Croatan elders. He explained that the new settlers were peaceful families who wished only to live in harmony, trade iron goods and cloth for fresh food, and share the land. He asked the Croatan elders to serve as diplomatic messengers to the surrounding mainland tribes, especially the Secotán nation, inviting them to a great peace council on Roanoke Island. White promised that all past grievances, killings, and misunderstandings would be forgiven and forgotten by the English. The Croatan elders agreed to carry the peace offer, but they gave Governor White a stern, honest warning. They told him that the mainland tribes, especially the people of Chief Wingina's former nation, were deeply bitter and filled with rage over the murder of their chief by Ralph Lane and the burning of their crops by Grenville. They warned White that the Secotán warriors would not easily forgive the English and that the settlers must remain extremely cautious. The truth of the Croatan elders' warning was proven in a tragic manner just a few days later. On July 28, 1587, an English settler named George Howe, who was a respected member of Governor White's governing council, walked away from the safety of the colony's timber palisade alone. Howe was an innocent, peaceful man who had gone down to the shallow marsh waters of the Sound to gather fresh crabs and oysters for his family's dinner. He was unarmed, carrying only a small wooden basket and a wooden stick. Hidden in the tall marsh grass near the water's edge was a war party of Secotán warriors led by Wanchese. Without warning, the warriors rose from the reeds and attacked George Howe. Howe was struck by 16 wooden arrows tipped with sharp stone points, and his body was left in the shallow water. When George Howe's body was discovered by the settlers later that evening, a wave of intense fear, panic, and outrage swept through the small colony. The settlers realized with terrifying clarity that the native warriors made no distinction between aggressive soldiers like Ralph Lane and peaceful civilian farmers like George Howe. To the Secotán nation, every English person on the island was an enemy who deserved to die. The settlers surrounded Governor White, demanding immediate military action and revenge for the murder of George Howe. White found himself in an agonizing position. He hated violence, but as governor, he had a duty to protect his people and demonstrate that the colony could defend itself against murder. Driven by fear and pressure from his panicked council, John White made a disastrous tactical mistake. On August 8, 1587, Governor White led a midnight raid across the Sound to the mainland village of Dasamangueponque, where Wanchese and the Secotán warriors who had killed George Howe were believed to be staying. White and his armed men moved silently through the dark forest under the cover of night, surrounding the thatched native homes just before the break of dawn. At a given signal, the English soldiers rushed into the village with drawn iron swords and loaded muskets, opening fire on the shadowy figures sleeping inside the wooden houses. A chilling scream went up from inside the village. As the morning light broke through the forest canopy, Governor White realized to his horror that a terrible mistake had been made. The village of Dasamangueponque was not occupied by Wanchese or the hostile Secotán warriors. Wanchese and his men had quietly abandoned the town days earlier, fearing an English strike. Instead, the village had been occupied by a peaceful group of Croatan people, Manteo's own family and friends, who had come to the abandoned village to gather remaining corn from the untended fields. The English had mistakenly attacked their only true friends and allies in the New World. One Croatoan woman had been wounded, and several others were injured before Manteo, running forward into the smoke, recognized his own people and screamed for the English soldiers to cease fire immediately. Governor White was crushed with remorse and deep embarrassment. He knelt before the injured Croatan people, offering deep apologies, explaining the tragic error, and promising that the English would care for their wounded. Manteo, though deeply pained by the tragic mistake, recognized that White had acted out of honest error rather than malicious hatred. Manteo stepped in once again to smooth over the grief, convincing his fellow Croatan people to accept Governor White's apologies and maintain their fragile alliance. To restore dignity and reinforce the vital bond between the English crown and Manteo's people, Governor White held a solemn, historic ceremony on Roanoke Island on August 13, 1587. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes. Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth. Governor John White formally baptized Manteo into the Christian faith. Manteo was given the official royal title of Lord of Roanoke and of Dasamungwaponke. It was the very first English noble title ever granted to an indigenous person in the Americas. Manteo was presented with a fine woolen coat and a silver medal, sitting beside Governor White as a recognized lord and equal ruler of the territory. The ceremony was meant to show the world that the city of Raleigh was built on a foundation of mutual honor, legal equality, and shared leadership between English citizens and native partners. As the hot days of mid-August arrived, a quiet, peaceful ceremony took place inside one of the newly constructed timber cabins of the settlement, an event that brought brief joy and bright hope to every heart in the anxious colony. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare, the daughter of Governor John White and wife of Ananias Dare, gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl. The birth of a child is always a moment of wonder, but on this small, isolated island, surrounded by dense wilderness and constant danger, it felt like a magnificent miracle. The baby was the very first English child born on the soil of the Americas. A few days later, on August 24th, the newborn child was baptized in a simple wooden chapel inside Fort Raleigh. In honor of the vast, wild, and beautiful land her people were trying to make their home, Governor White named his newborn granddaughter Virginia Dare. The settlers gathered around the simple wooden cradle, looking down at the small infant wrapped in clean linen cloth. To the 117 men and women living on Roanoke Island, baby Virginia Dare was not just a child, she was the living symbol of their entire future. She represented their hope that out of fear, isolation, and wilderness, a peaceful, permanent society could bloom. Yet, even as the settlers celebrated the birth of Virginia Dare, a dark, looming shadow was gathering over the settlement. The summer was ending. The ocean breezes were beginning to turn cool, and the supplies in the wooden warehouses were running dangerously low. The English ships commanded by Simon Fernandez were preparing to pull up their anchors and sail back across the Atlantic to England. The settlers looked at their small fields of corn, their empty supply crates, and the surrounding dense forests inhabited by hostile tribes. They realized with absolute clarity that without fresh supplies of food, iron tools, gunpowder, clothing, and new settlers from home, their small community could not survive the upcoming winter. They needed help, and they needed it immediately. But who would brave the dangerous ocean voyage back to England to speak to Sir Walter Raleigh and demand the help they so desperately required? Listen to the soft, gentle rustle of the oak leaves as a quiet evening breeze passes through the quiet village. The dark waters of the Sound lap peacefully against the sandy shore, reflecting the quiet light of a million stars overhead. Let your body sink deeper into total relaxation, allowing your mind to drift peacefully into a deep, uninterrupted sleep as the night enfolds you in complete calm. The news of Virginia Dare's birth had brought a fleeting wave of warmth and joy to the wooden houses of the Roanoke settlement. For a few brief days, the heavy anxiety that hung over the 117 settlers seemed to lift. Neighbors visited the simple timber home of Eleanor and Ananias Dare, stepping quietly across the wooden floorboards to peek into the wicker cradle where the tiny infant lay sleeping. She was a living symbol of hope, a tender proof that despite the vast ocean, the strange wilderness, and the shadows of past conflicts, a new English life was taking root on the shores of North America. Just 9 days after Virginia Dare's birth, on August 27, 1587, another child was born to the colony, a baby boy born to settlers Donage and Marjorie Harvey. The colony was growing, its roots deepening into the sandy coastal soil. However, outside the timber palisade walls of the village, the harsh realities of their survival situation were rapidly closing in. It was late August. The sweet scents of midsummer were giving way to the crisp, sharp air of approaching autumn. The small vegetable plots that the settlers had cleared and planted upon their arrival were not nearly large enough to yield a full harvest capable of feeding 117 people through a long coastal winter. Much of their original food supply brought from England had been damaged or lost during the ocean crossing, and pilot Simon Fernandez had flatly refused to give them time to forage for wild roots or hunt extensively on the mainland. Worse still, the surrounding indigenous tribes, still grieving the loss of Chief Wingina and angered by the accidental English raid on Dasamongeponke, refused to trade with the settlement. The native fish traps were empty or dismantled, and no corn was being brought to the fort gates. The colony was completely isolated. To make matters even more pressing, pilot Simon Fernandez made it clear that his 3 ships were preparing to weigh anchor and sail back to England before the autumn storms made crossing the Atlantic impossible. The governing council of the colony held urgent, late-night meetings inside the governor's timber house. The candles burned down to dark wax stubs as the men discussed their desperate predicament. They realized that if they remained on Roanoke Island without additional supplies, farm animals, iron tools, gunpowder, and fresh provisions, the colony would face absolute starvation before the spring sun returned. They needed to send a representative back to England aboard Fernandez's departing ships, someone who could speak directly to Sir Walter Raleigh, present a formal plea to Queen Elizabeth, and return immediately with a massive supply fleet. At first, the council suggested sending 2 of their high-ranking assistants back to London. But as the discussions continued, the settlers reached a unanimous, passionate consensus. Only one man possessed the political status, artistic skill, and personal passion required to convince Raleigh and the royal court to fund an immediate rescue mission. That man was Governor John White himself. When the council presented their request to John White, the governor initially refused. He was deeply reluctant to abandon his post. He pointed out that as governor, his legal duty was to stay on the island and guide his people through the winter. More importantly, his heart was bound to the settlement by the strongest human ties imaginable. His beloved daughter Eleanor, his son-in-law Ananias, and his newborn granddaughter Virginia Dare were all living in the timber houses of Fort Raleigh. White feared that if he left, his political enemies back in London might accuse him of cowardice, claiming that he had deserted his own people and fled back to safety at the first sign of trouble. The settlers, however, refused to take no for an answer. They drew up a formal legal document, signed by every member of the governing council, explicitly declaring that Governor John White was leaving the island at their urgent insistence and unanimous command. They insisted that only White, with his personal connections to Sir Walter Raleigh and his first-hand knowledge of the land, could secure the massive assistance the colony required. Standing on the sandy path outside his daughter's house on the evening of August 26th, John White made the most agonizing decision of his life. He agreed to cross the ocean back to England, promising his family and his people that he would return with a fully stocked relief fleet within 8 to 10 months, by the spring of 1588 at the absolute latest. Before White prepared to step onto the rowboat that would carry him to Fernandez's anchored ship, he held a private, crucial conference with his daughter Eleanor, his son-in-law Ananias, Lord Manteo, and the members of the council. They discussed the possibility that during his absence, the colony might find it necessary to leave Roanoke Island. The island's soil was poor, fresh water was limited, and the local Sikatan nation remained hostile. White and the council agreed that if food ran short or if safety became an issue, the 117 settlers would pack their belongings and move 50 miles inland into the mainland interior, possibly toward the fertile, deep-water region of the Chowan River, or north toward the original target of the Chesapeake Bay. To ensure that White could find them upon his return, they established a secret, coded communication system. Governor White instructed the settlers that if they were forced to abandon Roanoke Island before his return, they must carve the exact name of their new location into a prominent wooden tree trunk or doorpost at the entrance of the village. Furthermore, White added a critical security condition. If the settlers were forced to leave the island because of an immediate native attack, violent conflict, or dire emergency, they were to carve a specific symbol above or below the name, a Maltese cross, plus. If White returned and found a carved location name without the Maltese cross, he would know that the settlers had departed peacefully, under their own free will, and were safe in their new home. But if the cross was carved into the wood, White would know immediately that his family and people had been overwhelmed by violence and were in extreme danger. On the morning of August 27, 1587, Governor John White walked down to the sandy shore of Roanoke Island to say his final farewells. It was a deeply emotional moment. Eleanor Dare stood near the water's edge, holding tiny baby Virginia wrapped in a woolen blanket. Ananias Dare stood beside them, his arm wrapped around his wife's shoulders. The remaining 114 settlers, men, women and children, gathered along the beach, watching quietly. Governor White held his newborn granddaughter in his arms one last time, kissing her forehead and saying a silent prayer for her protection. He embraced his daughter Eleanor, promising her with tears in his eyes that he would move heaven and earth in London to bring back food, clothes, and safety. Eleanor smiled through her tears, trusting her father's solemn vow. John White stepped into the small wooden boat, and the sailors pulled away from the shore. As the rowboat glided across the calm, glassy water towards Simon Fernandez's ship, White stood up in the boat, waving his hat to the small group standing on the beach. He watched his daughter, his son-in-law, his granddaughter, and his people grow smaller and smaller until they were just tiny figures standing against the dark tree line of Roanoke Island. He did not know it then, but it was the very last time John White would ever see his family alive. The return journey across the Atlantic Ocean in the autumn of 1587 turned out to be a living nightmare of ocean storms, shipwrecks, and physical suffering. Pilot Simon Fernandez's ship, the flyboat, was understaffed and poorly maintained. Shortly after clearing the Outer Banks, the ship was hit by severe autumn gales. Massive waves slammed into the vessel, snapping wooden spars and tearing canvas sails. Water poured through leaks in the hull, forcing Governor White and the tired sailors to work the iron hand pumps day and night just to keep the ship from sinking into the dark ocean depths. To make matters worse, drinking water ran out and food turned moldy. Sickness swept through the small crew. Several sailors died during the crossing and were buried at sea. John White himself fell severely ill with fever, his body weakened by exhaustion and stress. For more than 6 grueling weeks, the battered ship drifted across the stormy Atlantic, blown off course by fierce winds. Finally, in early November 1587, the damaged vessel limped into the harbour of Smerwick in Western Ireland. White was so weak he could barely walk. but he managed to secure a horse and travel across Ireland to cross the Irish Sea, finally arriving in London in late November 1587. Despite his extreme exhaustion and ill health, John White did not waste a single day resting. As soon as his boots touched the cobblestones of London, he hurried straight to the grand palace estate of Sir Walter Raleigh. When Raleigh heard White's dramatic report, learning that 117 English men, women and children, including a newborn infant, were stranded on Roanoke Island surrounded by hostile forces, he acted with immediate, decisive vigor. Raleigh pledged his full personal fortune to organize a massive relief expedition. Raleigh and White immediately began purchasing supplies, hiring experienced captains, and fitting out a grand fleet of 7 heavy supply ships, loaded to the brim with provisions, livestock, tools, and fresh settlers. By early spring of 1588, the rescue fleet was fully equipped and anchored in the harbour of Bideford, ready to set sail across the Atlantic, back to Roanoke Island. John White felt an immense wave of relief wash over him. He had kept his promise. It was March 1588, just 7 months since he had left his daughter Eleanor and baby Virginia on the beach. He was on schedule to return long before the colony's supplies ran out. He could already picture the joy on his daughter's face when his heavy ships dropped anchor in Pamlico Sound, bringing relief, safety and abundance to the city of Raleigh. But just as the sailors were preparing to untie the mooring ropes and raise the canvas sails, a sudden, terrifying political crisis struck the Kingdom of England, a crisis that brought all world exploration to an absolute screeching halt. Listen to the soft, steady rhythm of the rain falling gently upon the roof. The dark night wraps around you like a warm, protective blanket, bringing absolute peace and quiet stillness to your mind. Let your breathing remain slow, deep, and effortless as you drift peacefully into a deep, uninterrupted slumber, resting securely in the calm embrace of the night. In the early spring months of 1588, a shadow of absolute terror fell over the entire Kingdom of England. Reports from spies, merchants, and sea captains across Europe confirmed a terrifying reality. King Philip II of Spain had assembled the largest, most formidable naval fleet in human history. It was the invincible Spanish Armada, a towering fleet of over 130 massive, heavily armed warships carrying 30,000 soldiers, dark iron cannon, and veteran commanders. Their explicit, brutal goal was to cross the English Channel, invade England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, execute her ministers, and absorb the Protestant island nation into the vast Spanish Catholic Empire. England was facing an immediate, existential threat to its very survival. In response to this looming catastrophe, Queen Elizabeth and her Privy Council issued a royal decree that struck Governor John White like an iron blade to the heart. The Crown issued a total embargo on all shipping throughout the realm. Every single ocean-going vessel, every captain, every sailor, every barrel of gunpowder, and every iron cannon in every harbour across England was legally impounded. No ship, regardless of its mission, size, or owner, was permitted to leave English waters under any circumstances. Every wooden hull was drafted into the Royal Navy to defend the homeland against the approaching Spanish invasion. Sir Walter Raleigh's magnificent 7-ship rescue fleet, sitting fully loaded in the harbour of Bideford and ready to sail to Roanoke, was suddenly seized by royal order. Governor John White was completely devastated. He rushed from council chambers to royal courts, begging ministers, lords, and naval officers to grant his rescue fleet an exemption. He pleaded with tears in his eyes, explaining that 117 English citizens, including 17 women and 2 newborn infants, were stranded thousands of miles away on a wilderness island, completely dependent on the food sitting in the holds of those impounded ships. His desperate pleas fell on deaf ears. To the royal ministers in London, Facing the total destruction of their kingdom by 30,000 Spanish soldiers, the fate of 117 settlers across the ocean was a tiny, tragic detail compared to the survival of England itself. The national emergency took absolute priority over everything else. Month after month passed in agonizing delay. The spring of 1588 turned into the hot summer, and still the rescue fleet remained locked in the harbour, its canvas sails tied tightly to the wooden yards, its crew drafted into Royal Naval Service. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes, walked the cobblestone streets of London every day in an agony of mind and spirit. Every time he looked at the clear summer sky, he pictured his daughter Eleanor, his son-in-law Ananias, and his granddaughter Virginia Dare. It was now August 1588, Virginia Dare's first birthday. White wondered with a breaking heart if his granddaughter had taken her first steps, if she was healthy, or if the settlers had already run out of food and were scouring the dark pine woods of Roanoke Island for wild berries and roots to survive. Through tireless persistence and political begging, John White finally managed to secure a small, desperate compromise in late spring of 1588. Sir Walter Raleigh gained special permission to release 2 small, low-value pinnaces, the Brave and the Roe, which were deemed too small to be of any real use in a heavy sea battle against giant Spanish galleons. The 2 small ships were loaded with a modest supply of food, tools, and gunpowder, and White was granted permission to sail. On April 22, 1588, John White set sail aboard the Brave, desperate to reach Roanoke Island. But this small expedition proved to be a total, heartbreaking disaster. The captains and crew hired for the 2 small ships were not disciplined naval officers. They were rough, greedy privateers who were far more interested in capturing Spanish merchant treasure than in delivering flour and salted pork to a quiet colony. While crossing the waters near the European coast, the captains intentionally went hunting for enemy ships to plunder. On May 6, 1588, off the coast of Madeira, the small English ship Brave was ambushed by 2 heavily armed French pirate vessels. A violent, bloody battle broke out on the wooden deck. Iron cannons roared, sending deadly splinters through the air, while men fought hand-to-hand with cutlasses and pistols. Governor John White fought bravely alongside the crew, but he was severely wounded in the battle, taking a deep blade wound to his head and a musket shot through his arm. The French pirates overwhelmed the English ship, boarding the deck and thoroughly looting the hold. They stole every barrel of food, every crate of tools, every bag of grain, and every piece of clothing intended for the Roanoke colony. They stripped Governor White of his personal belongings, leaving him bleeding on the ruined deck. Beaten, robbed, and completely out of provisions, the damaged Brave was forced to turn around and limp back to England, docking in Plymouth on May 22, 1588. John White had failed. The small relief effort was destroyed, and he returned to London empty-handed, physically wounded, and spiritually crushed. Just 2 months later, in late July 1588, the Grand Crisis reached its terrifying climax. The giant Spanish Armada appeared in the English Channel, its heavy warships forming a massive, 6-mile-wide crescent moon formation on the grey water. For 2 violent, historic weeks, the fate of the Western world hung in the balance. Small, fast, agile English ships commanded by Sir Francis Drake, Sir Richard Grenville, and Lord Howard engaged the heavy Spanish galleons in fierce ocean battles. English fireships were sent drifting into the crowded Spanish fleet at night, causing total panic and confusion. Then, a sudden, catastrophic Atlantic storm, which the English proudly hailed as the Protestant wind, struck the Channel. The howling gales drove the massive Spanish ships onto dangerous rocks and reefs around the coastline of Scotland and Ireland, smashing the invincible Armada to pieces. England had won a miraculous, historic victory. The Spanish threat was broken, and the realm erupted in wild celebration. Feasts were held in the streets, bonfires lit the night sky, and Queen Elizabeth was praised throughout Europe as a triumphant ruler. Yet, amid the wild national celebrations and ringing church bells of London, John White walked through the joyful crowds in utter, silent grief. To White, the glorious victory over Spain meant only one thing: time had run out. A full year had passed since he had stepped off the beach at Roanoke Island. An entire year had slipped away while his country fought for its life, leaving his daughter, his granddaughter, and 115 other souls completely isolated on the edge of an unexplored continent. Even after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the nightmare of delay did not end for John White. The English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean remained filled with scattered Spanish warships, privateers, and hostile naval activity. The English government maintained strict control over large ships, refusing to allow merchants or privateers to undertake long ocean voyages without royal defense permits. To make matters worse, Sir Walter Raleigh was facing severe financial ruin. He had spent his vast personal fortune organizing, equipping, and maintaining the various Roanoke expeditions, as well as funding home defense forces during the Armada invasion. Raleigh was deeply in debt and could no longer afford to finance a massive, dedicated fleet solely to search for the lost colony. His political attention was shifting toward new enterprises in Ireland and South America. For 2 long, agonizing years, from late 1588 through the entirety of 1589, John White lived in a state of living torment. He spent every single day in London searching for ship captains, wealthy merchants, or privateer syndicates who were planning voyages toward the West Indies. He begged for passage, offered to work as a mapmaker or clerk, and pleaded with anyone who would listen to stop at Roanoke Island just for a few days to locate his missing family. Winter gave way to spring, summer faded into autumn, and still no ship would take him. Imagine the crushing weight of grief and helplessness John White carried in his heart through those long, silent nights in London. Every time the rain fell against his window pane, every time the winter cold bit into his bones, he pictured his tiny granddaughter Virginia. Was she 3 years old now? Was she playing with wooden toys in a quiet cabin, or had she starved in her mother's arms during the cold winter of 1588? Had the Secretan warriors burned the village, or had Lord Manteo guided the families to safety in the deep pine forests of Croatoan? The uncertainty was a constant, gnawing wound that never healed. Finally, in early 1590, nearly 3 full years after he had said goodbye to his daughter on the sandy beach, a tiny ray of hope appeared in the dark. A wealthy London merchant named John Watts was fitting out a fleet of privateer warships, including the Hopewell and the Moonlight, to sail to the West Indies to raid Spanish shipping lanes. Sir Walter Raleigh used his remaining political influence to force John Watts to allow Governor John White to take passage aboard the Hopewell. However, the contract terms imposed on White were harsh and cruel. The privateer captain, a rough, greedy officer named Abraham Koch, made it explicitly clear that he was sailing to the West Indies to capture wealthy Spanish treasure ships. He agreed to stop at Roanoke Island only after his privateering raids in the Caribbean were complete, and only if time, weather, and ocean currents permitted. John White had no choice. He accepted the cruel terms. He boarded the Hopewell in March 1590, embarking on a long, winding voyage through the West Indies, participating in naval battles and privateer hunts, while his heart burned with desperate impatience to reach his lost family. Finally, in early August 1590, 3 years to the exact month since he had left his people, the Hopewell and the Moonlight turned their wooden hulls north, sailing along the sandy coast of North America toward the Outer Banks. Listen to the calm, steady sound of the wind blowing softly through the quiet night air. The ocean of time stretches wide and peaceful, bringing total stillness and quiet comfort to your resting mind. Let your body relax completely, drifting effortlessly into a deep, unbroken sleep as the gentle shadows of the night wrap around you in complete peace. On the morning of August 15th, 1590, the heavy iron anchors of the Hopewell and the Moonlight plunged with a loud splash into the blue waters off the Outer Banks of Virginia. 3 full years had passed since Governor John White had stepped off the sandy beach of Roanoke Island, leaving behind his daughter Eleanor, his son-in-law Ananias, and his tiny granddaughter, Virginia Dare. 3 long years of war, shipwreck, political delays, and endless night worries had brought him back at last to the exact same spot on the edge of the world. It was late summer. The sun beat down through a warm, humid sea haze that hung over the barrier islands. The air smelled of salt, marsh grass, and warm pine resin, a familiar fragrance that brought a rush of intense memories to the old governor's heart. August 18th, 1590, just 3 days after their arrival, was a date written in gold upon John White's mind. It was the 3rd birthday of his granddaughter, Virginia Dare. As White stood on the wooden deck of the Hopewell, scanning the low green tree line of Roanoke Island through his brass glass, his heart pounded with a mixture of desperate hope and overwhelming dread. Were his loved ones still alive inside the wooden houses of Fort Raleigh? Had they survived the harsh winters, the lack of English supplies, and the hostile Secretan warriors? Was Virginia Dare, a healthy, energetic 3-year-old child, playing in the sandy yards, or had the colony dissolved into tragedy long ago? That very evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a sudden shout from a sailor on watch sent a wave of electric excitement through the ship. Rising above the dark canopy of trees on the northern point of Roanoke Island was a thick, distinct plume of grey smoke. John White felt an immense rush of joy wash over him. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant human hands at work. To White and the sailors, it seemed like a clear, intentional signal fire lit by the colonists to welcome the returning English ships. Immediately, Governor White ordered his men to sound the ship's trumpet and fire the iron cannons into the quiet evening air. The loud booms of the cannons echoed across the calm waters of the Sound, accompanied by the bright, cheerful brass notes of the trumpet playing traditional English tunes. White waited in breathless anticipation, expecting to see answering fires or rowboats coming out from the shore to greet them, but no answer came. The quiet woods remained completely silent. The grey smoke continued to rise slowly into the calm evening sky, drifting away into the darkening clouds. John White refused to wait until morning. He ordered a landing party to prepare the wooden rowboats immediately, but as the sailors pulled toward the shore under the cover of dusk, they ran into dangerous ocean currents and shallow sandbars. Night fell quickly, wrapping the coast in ink-black darkness. Unable to navigate the treacherous inlet in the dark, the men were forced to anchor their rowboats near the beach, waiting in the damp night air for the first light of dawn. On the morning of August 17, 1590, a terrible accident struck the landing party, turning their hope into sudden tragedy. While attempting to cross the dangerous ocean inlet between the barrier islands, a massive, unexpected sea breaker slammed into the second rowboat, capsizing the wooden vessel in the churning white surf. The heavy iron cannons, supply chests, and men were thrown violently into the crashing waves. 7 English sailors, including the veteran sea captain of the Moonlight, Edward Spicer, were dragged down by the heavy ocean currents and drowned before their crewmates could reach them. The surviving sailors were thoroughly shaken, panicked, and demoralized by the sudden deaths of their comrades. They gathered along the sandy beach, refusing to go any further into the wilderness. They argued bitterly, insisting that Roanoke Island was cursed, that the waters were too dangerous, and that they should return to the heavy safety of the Hopewell. Governor John White faced another crisis of leadership. He stood among the wet, frightened sailors on the beach, begging them not to abandon the mission when they were so close to finding the truth. With passionate, desperate words, White managed to restore order, convincing 11 brave men to join him in rowing across the Sound to the location where the smoke had been spotted the night before. When White and his men finally reached the northern shore where the smoke had risen, they pushed through the thick coastal bushes and pine trees to find the source of the fire. What they found was a bitter, disappointing frustration. The fire was not a signal lit by English settlers. It was a wild, natural brush fire that had consumed an overgrown patch of grass and dead cedar trees, burning silently in the untended woods. There were no English boots near the embers, no tools, no signs of a camp. Only cold ash, charred sticks, and the quiet rustle of wind through the live oaks. With a heavy heart, Governor John White turned his small squad toward the sandy path he knew so well, the path leading directly to the settlement site of Fort Raleigh. As White walked along the overgrown trail, he instructed his sailors to sing traditional English songs out loud, to shout friendly greetings, and to blow their trumpets at every turn, hoping that if any English settlers were hiding in the woods, they would recognize the voices of their countrymen and step out from the shadows. Their shouts echoed through the quiet forest. "Eleanor, Ananias, we have returned. Help has arrived." The only answer was the hollow echo of their own voices, dying away into the vast, silent pine forest. As White approached the clearing where the city of Raleigh had been constructed 3 years earlier, he noticed that the surrounding landscape had changed dramatically. The small open fields that the settlers had cleared for corn and vegetable gardens were completely swallowed by nature. Wild saplings, thick briars, crawling melon vines, and tall marsh grass had grown up over every foot of cleared land, completely erasing the boundaries of the farm plots. Then, John White stepped out into the open space of the village site itself. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the scene in total, absolute shock. The wooden houses, the comfortable timber cabins with pitched roofs, stone chimneys, and wooden glass windows that he had helped his daughter and son-in-law build in the summer of 1587, were entirely gone. They had not been burned to the ground by hostile fire, as Fort Raleigh had been during the 1586 attack. There were no charred beams, no heaps of black ash, no burnt timber frames. The houses had been carefully, methodically taken down, piece by piece. The timber walls, the roof planks, the wooden door frames, and the stone hearths had been systematically dismantled and removed from the site. The entire village had been cleared away, leaving only an empty, overgrown grass field surrounded by ancient live oak trees. John White walked slowly across the silent clearing, his boots sinking into the soft, damp soil where his daughter's home had once stood. It was as if 117 men, women and children had never existed on the island at all, as if their homes, their laughter, their tears, and their daily struggles had been swept away by an invisible hand, leaving behind only the quiet rustle of the coastal forest and the distant, rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore. Where an English village had stood 3 years before, there was now only an empty field of green weeds, surrounded by high timber walls that had been built after his departure. Governor John White stood alone in the center of the ruined settlement, looking around at the quiet trees. He knew that the colony was gone. The houses were empty, the hearths were cold, and the people had vanished into the unknown. But as White stepped closer to the entrance of the newly constructed timber palisade walls, his eyes caught sight of something carved deep into the smooth wood of a heavy post, a physical clue left behind by human hands, preserved like a whisper from the past in the quiet morning light. Listen to the calm, gentle sound of the wind moving softly through the tall oak branches. The dark coastal night wraps around you in complete, effortless peace, bringing rest and quiet stillness to your mind. Let your body sink deeply into your bed, breathing slowly and steadily as you fall into a deep, peaceful sleep, guided by the silent, gentle mystery of time. Governor John White walked slowly toward the high wooden palisade fence that enclosed the perimeter of the vanished village site. The heavy wooden posts, thick pine trunks stripped of their bark and driven deep into the earth, had been erected after White's departure in 1587 to strengthen the colony's defences. As White approached the main entrance gate, his eyes locked onto a prominent wooden post standing at the corner of the entryway. There, carved firmly into the smooth wood of the tree trunk at eye level, were 3 capital letters, C-R-O. John White stood frozen, staring at the letters. The wood around the carving was weathered and darkened by years of rain, salt air and sun, proving that the mark had been made long before his arrival. Moving closer, White carefully examined the wood surrounding the 3 carved letters. He searched every inch of the post, looking above, below, and beside the mark for the specific security signal he and the settlers had agreed upon 3 years earlier, the Maltese cross. There was no cross. The wood around the letters C-R-O was completely clean and unmarred by any mark of distress. White's heart leaped with a sudden surge of cautious hope. According to their secret agreement of 1587, if the settlers had been forced to flee the island because of an immediate native attack, violence, or dire emergency, they were required to carve a Maltese cross beside their message. The total absence of the cross meant one clear, vital thing to Governor White: his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, and the 115 colonists had not been slaughtered in a surprise massacre. They had departed Roanoke Island under their own free will, peacefully, methodically, and with planned purpose. Stepping through the ruined gateway into the interior of the palisade, White walked along the wooden fence line toward the site where the main entrance gate had once swung. There, on a thick, solid corner post of the fort palisade, White found a second, far more detailed inscription. Carved cleanly into the timber, in clear, elegant block letters, 5 feet off the ground, was a single, complete word: C-R-O-A-T-O-A-N. It was the name of the barrier island, located 50 miles to the south, present-day Hatteras Island, where Lord Manteo's people lived. It was the home of the friendly Croatoan tribe, who had welcomed White with feasts of fresh fish and corn in 1587, and who had pledged their enduring friendship to the English crown. To John White, the message carved into the fort post was as clear as if his daughter Eleanor had spoken to him in person. The settlers had found it impossible to stay on Roanoke Island. With their food supplies exhausted, surrounded by hostile mainland Secatan tribes, and facing cold winter months without an English supply ship, they had made the logical, strategic decision to pack their belongings, dismantle their wooden homes for reusable timber, and relocate 50 miles south to the safe, friendly island of Croatoan under the personal protection of Lord Manteo. White's eyes scanned the surrounding ground inside the palisade, looking for further evidence to confirm his theory. Scatterings of heavy, abandoned items lay among the tall weeds inside the fort. Heavy iron cannons, large iron swivels, lead musket balls, and rusty iron anchors lay where they had been left, far too heavy to be transported in small wooden rowboats across the Sound. While searching the perimeter near the forest edge, several sailors called out to Governor White. They had discovered a trench where the settlers had buried heavy iron chests before their departure, hoping to protect their most valuable possessions from rain and native gatherers until White's return. The trench had been dug up, and its contents lay scattered across the damp soil. John White walked over to the spot and looked down in quiet sorrow. Lying in the mud were his own personal wooden chests he had left behind in his daughter's care 3 years earlier. The wooden covers had been smashed open, and their contents were ruined by years of rain, mud, and foraging animals. White picked up the soaked, mouldy remains of his fine watercolor paintings, the delicate historic artwork he had created to document the plant life, wildlife, and native communities of the New World. His personal books were torn to pieces, their leather bindings rotting in the weeds, and his fine clothes and armor were ruined by rust and mud. Native gatherers, or hostile Secatan warriors, had clearly discovered the buried chests after the settlers departed, digging them up and looting anything of value while destroying what they could not use. Yet, despite the destruction of his life's artistic work, John White felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over his spirit. The physical evidence on Roanoke Island fit together like pieces of a grand puzzle. The methodical dismantling of the houses, the absence of human bones or burnt timber, the clean carving of the word Croatoan, and the total absence of the Maltese cross all pointed to one singular, encouraging conclusion: his family was alive. They were living safely 50 miles to the south on the island of Croatoan, surrounded by Manteo's welcoming people, waiting for an English ship to arrive in the Sound to bring them home. Governor John White and to the privateer captain of the Hopewell, Abraham Cock, and the surviving ship officers, with intense, passionate energy, White begged the captains to pull up their anchors immediately and sail 50 miles south toward Croatoan Island. Captain Abraham Cock agreed. The plan was clear and simple. They would sail the Hopewell and the Moonlight south along the Barrier Islands, anchor in the deep waters near Hatteras Inlet, send rowboats ashore to Croatoan Island, locate Lord Manteo's village, reunite Governor White with his daughter Eleanor and granddaughter Virginia Dare, and carry the surviving colonists back to England or supply them with fresh food from the ship's holds. It seemed that after 3 long years of agonizing delay, John White was just hours away from holding his granddaughter in his arms. On the morning of August 18, 1590, the exact day of Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, the English crew rowed back to the anchored ships, pulled up their iron anchors, and unfurled their canvas sails, turning their wooden hulls south toward Croatoan Island. But as the ships cleared the northern tip of Roanoke Island and moved into the open waters near the ocean inlet, the sky began to change rapidly. The warm, humid sea haze that had hung over the islands for days was suddenly swallowed by dark, bruised storm clouds rolling in from the east. The wind shifted violently, howling across the water with terrifying force. White ocean breakers began crashing over the dangerous sandbars around the inlet, turning the shallow coastal waters into a churning cauldron of white foam and roaring waves. A severe late summer Atlantic hurricane was sweeping onto the coast of North America. The privateer ships were caught in a deadly trap. The fierce gales blew directly toward the shore, pushing the heavy wooden vessels dangerously close to the sharp sandbars of the Outer Banks. If a ship struck a sandbar in those roaring breakers, its wooden bottom would be smashed to splinters in minutes, killing every man on board. Captain Abraham Cock ordered his sailors to drop all available heavy iron anchors to prevent the ships from being driven onto the shallow beach. For a terrifying day and night, the Hopewell rode out the violent storm, her wooden hull creaking, her masts groaning under the strain, and giant ocean waves crashing over her forecastle. Then, with a sudden, deafening snap, the primary anchor cable of the Hopewell parted under the immense tension. The heavy iron anchor sank into the dark mud below, lost forever, leaving the ship drifting rapidly toward the breakers. The sailors scrambled to drop their second, smaller anchor, but its cable snapped as well. With 2 of her primary anchors lost, her supply of fresh drinking water contaminated by seawater, and the storm raging with unchecked fury, the Hopewell was in imminent danger of total destruction. Captain Abraham Cock held a desperate council with Governor John White and his officers on the violently swaying deck. Cock declared firmly that it was impossible to remain near the shallow, treacherous inlets of the Outer Banks without anchors. To stay near the coast meant certain shipwreck and death for every man on board. Koch proposed a drastic emergency course of action. They would turn the ships away from the dangerous land, sail east out into the deep, open waters of the Atlantic Ocean to ride out the storm, and then head south toward the warm Caribbean islands of the West Indies. There, in safe harbors, they could repair their damaged rigging, collect fresh drinking water, purchase new iron anchors, and spend the winter privateering against Spanish shipping. Koch promised Governor John White that in the spring of 1591, when the storm season had passed and the ships were fully repaired, they would return to the coast of North America and complete their search for the settlers at Croatoan Island. John White fought against the decision with every ounce of his remaining strength. He begged, pleaded, and wept on the deck, pointing toward the dark line of Croatoan Island, visible in the distance through the rain. He offered his own personal money, his land claims, and his remaining authority as governor if they would only wait a few more days for the storm to pass. But the privateer crew and Captain Koch refused. They were exhausted, terrified of shipwreck, out of fresh water, and unwilling to risk their lives any further for a colony that was not their personal responsibility. With heavy hearts and silent tears, the sailors turned the heavy wooden wheel. The Hopewell turned her bow away from the barrier islands, spreading her storm sails, and drove out into the dark, roaring expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. John White stood at the stern of the ship, clinging to the wooden rail in the pouring rain. Through the storm mist, he watched the dark silhouette of Croatoan Island sink below the horizon, fading away into the grey gloom of the storm. He did not know it then, but he was looking at the shores of North America for the very last time. The promised return in the spring of 1591 never happened. The Hopewell, battered by further Atlantic storms, was blown far off course, forced to seek shelter in the Azores before eventually limping back to England in late 1590. Sir Walter Raleigh, utterly bankrupt and stripped of royal favour after a political scandal at court, could no longer finance another expedition. John White, penniless, broken in body and crushed in spirit, was never able to raise the money to return across the ocean. John White spent the remaining years of his life living quietly on an estate in County Cork, Ireland, surrounded by green hills, quiet pastures, and the silent memories of the land across the sea. In a heartbreaking letter written in 1593 to his friend, the historian Richard Hakluyt, John White expressed his final, peaceful acceptance of his family's fate. He wrote that he committed his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, and his beloved settlers into the hands of Almighty God, taking comfort in his firm belief that they were living safely among their friendly native hosts on the island of Croatoan. Listen to the calm, steady rhythm of the rain falling gently outside your window. The dark, quiet night wraps around you like a soft, warm blanket, bringing total stillness and quiet peace to your mind. Let your body relax completely, breathing slowly and effortlessly as you drift into a deep, unbroken sleep, resting securely in the timeless calm of the night. More than 400 years, the complete vanishing of the 117 men, women and children of the Roanoke settlement has captured the human imagination like no other historical mystery. What truly became of Eleanor Dare, her husband Ananias, and little Virginia Dare after Governor John White's ship was driven out to sea by the violent storm of 1590? Did they perish in the quiet coastal woods, or did their lives unfold in unexpected, remarkable ways that were recorded not in English history books, but in the oral traditions of indigenous nations and the hidden archives of early America? Over the centuries, historians, archaeologists, and investigators have pieced together three major, highly compelling theories that explain the ultimate fate of the lost colony. The first, most widely accepted and historically supported explanation is the assimilation theory, the belief that the English settlers successfully relocated to Croatoan Island and gradually merged with Lord Manteo's friendly Croatan people. When Governor John White found the word Croatoan carved into the fort post in 1590, the physical evidence pointed directly to this path. The settlers were out of European food, lacked iron farming tools, and were surrounded by hostile mainland Secatan villages. Moving 50 miles south to Croatoan Island, present-day Hatteras Island, was their safest, most logical choice. Lord Manteo had spent months living in London, spoke fluent English, was a baptized Christian lord, and possessed a deep, enduring affection for the colonists. On Croatoan Island, the English families would have found a welcoming community, rich fishing grounds, and safety behind coastal dunes. As the years turned into decades, and no English relief ships appeared on the horizon, the settlers would have realized that their future lay not in waiting for a distant homeland, but in adapting to the world around them. English carpenters and bricklayers like Ananias Dare would have shared their building techniques, while native women taught Eleanor Dare how to process indigenous corn, gather medicinal marsh herbs, and weave comfortable garments from natural fibers. English men would have hunted alongside Croatan warriors, while young children like Virginia Dare grew up speaking both the English language and the Algonquian tongue, bridging two distinct worlds into a single, unified community. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes by intriguing historical evidence gathered decades later. When English explorers established the permanent settlement of Jamestown in Virginia in 1607, 17 years after John White's search, they began asking local native tribes about the fate of the earlier Roanoke colonists. Several indigenous leaders reported that a group of European people, dressed in cloth garments and living in wooden houses, were living quietly among the coastal tribes to the south. Furthermore, in the early 1700s, when European travelers first explored the interior region of North Carolina, they encountered the Hatteras Indians, the direct descendants of the Croatan tribe. John Lawson, an English surveyor who visited the Hatteras tribe in 1701, recorded a remarkable account in his published journals. Lawson noted that several members of the Hatteras tribe possessed striking European physical traits, including light grey and blue eyes, fair hair, and facial features distinct from surrounding native populations. Most importantly, the Hatteras elders told Lawson that their ancestors had been white people who could read from paper books, and that several of their grandfathers had been English settlers who came off a wooden ship many years before. To this day, family surnames that belonged to the 1587 Roanoke settlers, such as Dare, White, Harvey, Cooper, Sampson, and Lucas, remain remarkably common among the Lumbee and Hatteras indigenous communities of eastern North Carolina. The second major explanation is the inland migration theory, the idea that the colony divided into two separate groups, with the main body moving deep into the mainland interior toward the Chowan River or the Chesapeake Bay. Before Governor John White left for England in 1587, he and the governing council had discussed moving the colony 50 miles inland if life on Roanoke Island proved unsustainable. The mainland interior offered fertile, dark farm soil, fresh river water, protection from ocean hurricanes, and a safer environment far removed from coastal privateer raids. Recent archaeological discoveries support this inland migration path. In 2012, researchers at the First Colony Foundation re-examined a detailed hand-drawn map created by Governor John White in 1585, known as the Virginia Pars Map. Using modern non-destructive imaging technology, scientists looked beneath two paper patches that White had pasted over specific areas of the map. Hidden under one of the paper patches, located 50 miles inland at the confluence of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers in Bertie County, North Carolina, was a distinct hidden symbol, a hand-drawn blue and red fortress outline, known today as Site X. Archaeological excavations at Site X revealed extraordinary physical evidence. Digging deep beneath the topsoil, team members uncovered fragments of 16th century English borderware pottery, iron nails, glass beads, and brass casting counters, items that match the exact time frame and material culture of the 1587 Roanoke colonists. These artifacts were found within an ancient native settlement site, indicating that a small group of English settlers had moved inland and lived alongside the local Roanoke community for years after vanishing from Roanoke Island. It is highly probable that the colony split strategically, a smaller detachment remaining on Croatoan Island with Manteo to watch for returning English supply ships, while the main body of families moved inland to Site X to establish permanent farms in the rich river valley. The third, darker explanation is the conflict and Powhatan theory, a narrative that suggests a portion of the colonists met a tragic end through regional native warfare. When Captain John Smith established Jamestown in 1607, he was brought before the Supreme Chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, Chief Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas. According to records written by Smith and William Strachey, Chief Powhatan made a dramatic, shocking confession. Powhatan claimed that a group of English settlers had been living peacefully for nearly 20 years in the northern region near the Chesapeake Bay, residing among the local Chesapeake tribe. Powhatan stated that shortly before the arrival of the Jamestown ships in 1607, his spiritual priests warned him that a foreign empire arising from the east would overthrow his rule. Driven by fear and political paranoia, Chief Powhatan ordered his warriors to launch a violent, surprise night attack on the Chesapeake tribe, slaughtering their people and killing the English settlers who lived among them to prevent them from allying with new English arrivals. Powhatan even showed John Smith captured European items, including an iron musket barrel, a brass mortar, and tailored woolen clothes, as physical proof of his claim. While this dark account suggests that a group of settlers met a tragic end near the Chesapeake Bay, it does not contradict the other theories. It is entirely possible that different factions of the 117 settlers followed different paths, some perishing in the Powhatan conflict in the north, some farming along the Chowan River at Site X, and others thriving permanently among the Croatan people on Hatteras Island. As the centuries passed, the physical evidence of the lost colony faded into the quiet soil, but their story lived on in local legend, folklore, and quiet bedtime tales told along the Outer Banks. One of the most haunting and enduring legends of the region is the story of the white deer of Roanoke. According to coastal folklore passed down through generations, as Virginia Dare grew into a young woman on the quiet shores of Croatoan, she became renowned throughout the region for her beauty, grace, and deep gentleness of spirit. She learned the quiet arts of the forest, walking fearlessly through the high oak woods alongside Lord Manteo's people. Legend tells that a jealous, dark medicine man, angered that Virginia turned away his suit, cast a powerful spell upon her, transforming the young English girl into a pure, snow-white deer that roamed the silent forests of Roanoke Island. The story says that for years, hunters in the region reported seeing a magnificent, glowing white deer gliding silently through the live oaks and sand dunes near the ruins of Fort Raleigh. The white deer moved like a gentle ghost, showing no fear of humans and disappearing into the coastal sea mist whenever approached. According to the legend, a brave young native warrior who loved Virginia sought to break the spell. He crafted a special arrow tipped with a polished mother-of-pearl shell, known to possess magical healing properties. On a quiet, moonlit evening near the old fort site, the warrior spotted the white deer standing along the water's edge. He released his bowstring, and the pearl arrow struck the white deer through the heart. As the deer fell onto the soft white sand, a bright, shimmering light enveloped its form. The animal shape dissolved away, and for a brief, magical moment, the beautiful form of Virginia Dare reappeared, smiling peacefully at the warrior, before her spirit drifted gently away on the evening ocean breeze. Folklore claims that to this day, on quiet, misty summer nights when the full moon shines brightly over Pamlico Sound, travelers walking along the quiet beaches near Fort Raleigh can still catch a brief glimpse of a snow-white deer moving silently through the shadows of the live oaks, standing watch over the island where she was born. Whether viewed through the cold lens of archaeological facts, the rich oral histories of indigenous nations, or the gentle beauty of coastal legends, one truth remains clear: the settlers of the lost colony of Roanoke did not simply vanish into nothingness. They became part of the landscape itself. Their stories, their bloodlines, their dreams, and their courage dissolved into the rich, damp soil of the New World, weaving the very first threads of a shared human story that spans across oceans, cultures, and generations. Listen to the calm, soothing whisper of the wind rustling through the high branches of the ancient live oaks. The dark coastal waters roll gently onto the sandy shore, carrying away the lingering questions of the past into complete, quiet peace. Let your mind rest in this quiet stillness as your body sinks into a deep, uninterrupted slumber, drifting peacefully under a vast canopy of silent, shining stars. The mystery of Roanoke Island did not end with Governor John White's silent departure in 1590, nor did it fade away with the quiet passing of the centuries. Instead, the story of the 117 lost settlers became an enduring, magnetic quest, a historical puzzle that would pull generation after generation of scientists, historians, archaeologists, and dreamers back to the sandy beaches and dense pine forests of North America's Outer Banks. As the centuries rolled by, the quiet island of Roanoke underwent a profound transformation. The dense, untouched wilderness that John White, Eleanor Dare, and Lord Manteo once walked slowly yielded to the steady march of time. Modern towns were built, paved roads cut through the live oak groves, and gentle coastal homes took root along the shores of Pamlico Sound. Yet, beneath the quiet sand, deep within the damp coastal soil, the physical clues of the 16th century remained hidden, waiting silently for modern science to uncover their long-held secrets. In the late 19th and throughout the 20th centuries, formal archaeological investigations began at the site of Fort Raleigh. Early researchers, working with simple iron shovels and hand screens, mapped the faint outlines of the earthworks that Governor Ralph Lane's soldiers had dug in 1585. They uncovered rusted iron nail fragments, pieces of glazed European pottery, lead musket balls, and charcoal from ancient campfire hearths. These early digs confirmed that Fort Raleigh was not a myth. It was a physical, tangible place where real human beings had fought for survival on the edge of an unknown continent. However, as archaeological methods became more sophisticated in the 21st century, researchers began asking deeper questions. They realized that finding small artifacts inside the fort was only a piece of the puzzle. To understand what truly happened to the 117 men, women, and children of the 1587 city of Raleigh, they needed to look far beyond the wooden palisade walls of Fort Raleigh. They needed to examine the surrounding environment, the tree rings of ancient forests, and the soil profiles across the entire region. In the late 1990s, a breakthrough scientific discovery shed unprecedented light on the extreme environmental crisis that faced the lost colony. A discovery made not by digging in the dirt, but by analyzing the hidden rings of living trees. A team of climate scientists led by Dr. David Stahl from the University of Arkansas conducted a comprehensive tree ring study of ancient bald cypress trees growing along the Black River in North Carolina and surrounding coastal regions. Some of these towering gnarled trees had been living quietly in the swamps for over 800 years, their dense wood layers acting as a precise, year-by-year environmental diary of climate conditions extending far back into the Middle Ages. When the scientists examined the tree ring growth patterns corresponding to the late 16th century, they uncovered a shocking, dramatic truth. The year 1587, the exact summer that Governor John White landed his 117 civilian settlers on Roanoke Island, marked the beginning of the most severe, devastating natural drought in the entire southeastern United States in over 800 years. This catastrophic climate event, known today as the Great Drought of 1587 to 1589, was an environmental disaster of unprecedented scale. For 3 consecutive years, almost no rain fell across the Outer Banks and the surrounding mainland rivers. The water table dropped drastically, freshwater wells turned brackish and salty, small streams dried into muddy trickles, and native corn crops withered and died in the baked soil across the entire region. This scientific discovery fundamentally transformed our modern understanding of the Roanoke mystery. Before this climate data was uncovered, many historians criticized the colonists, assuming they were lazy, incompetent, or foolish for failing to grow enough food to feed their families. But the tree ring data proved that Eleanor Dare, Ananias Dare, and their neighbors were stepping into an environmental nightmare beyond human control. The local native tribes, including Chief Wingina's Secotan people and Lord Manteo's Croatoan tribe, were themselves facing extreme starvation and severe water shortages. The native fish traps were empty because river levels were too low, and native families were forced to disperse into smaller foraging groups across the swamps just to find wild roots and berries to survive. When Governor John White left for England in August 1587, he was leaving his family on an island that was experiencing a historic ecological collapse. The settlers did not abandon Roanoke Island simply out of fear of native attack or boredom. They were forced off the island because there was literally no fresh water to drink and no food to harvest. The Great Drought forced the 117 colonists to make an immediate life-or-death choice: stay on Roanoke Island and perish of thirst and starvation, or divide their community and move to locations where water and food could still be found. This environmental reality aligns perfectly with the recent physical discoveries made by modern archaeologists at Site X in Bertie County, North Carolina, and on Hatteras Island, the ancient home of the Croatoan people. At Hatteras Island, Archaeological Society and international researchers have unearthed remarkable 16th century European artifacts buried alongside indigenous items. Deep within ancient native village layers, excavators uncovered high-status English trade items, including a copper signet ring bearing the image of a lion, fragments of German stoneware jugs, iron slate pencils, brass book clasps, and specialized iron tools. These artifacts were not plunder taken in battle. They were personal, high-value belongings brought by English families who had settled peacefully among the Croatoan people, living alongside them, sharing their homes, and adapting to the drought together. Simultaneously, at Site X near the Chowan River, the First Colony Foundation uncovered English pottery fragments matching the exact chemical composition of vessels brought over on John White's 1587 fleet. The physical evidence strongly indicates that a significant portion of the families moved inland, using the deep river system to establish small farmsteads where water was more reliable, blending over time into the local Chowanoke and Tuscarora populations. In recent years, modern genetic science has joined the search for the lost colony. The Lost Colony DNA project has spent years collecting genetic samples from long-standing families in eastern North Carolina, specifically among the Lumbee, Hatteras, and Melungeon indigenous communities, searching for specific European genetic markers that date back to the late 16th century. Preliminary findings have identified unique genetic lineages that suggest European ancestors were mixing with indigenous populations long before the arrival of later 17th century English settlers. When we piece together all the evidence, the carved word Croatoan on the fort post, the clean absence of the Maltese cross, the tree ring climate records of the Great Drought, the 16th century artifacts at Hatteras and Site X, the oral traditions of the Hatteras tribe, and the modern DNA research, the grand mystery of Roanoke resolves not into a ghost story of sudden spooky vanishing, but into an inspiring narrative of human resilience, adaptability, and survival. The 1117 men, women, and children of the city of Raleigh did not disappear into thin air. They did not vanish into a void. Faced with a terrifying climate drought, isolated by a global war across the sea, and abandoned by circumstances beyond their control, Eleanor Dare, Ananias Dare, Lord Manteo, and their fellow settlers made a courageous choice. They broke down the artificial walls of their wooden fort, stepped out of their comfort zone, and reached across cultural divides to unite with the indigenous people who knew how to live in harmony with the land. They survived by becoming part of the New World itself. They became the first true bridge between two vastly different human worlds, weaving English bloodlines, language, and traditions into the rich, ancient fabric of Native American life. Little Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, did not grow up in a quiet English country manor. She grew up under the broad canopy of ancient live oaks, listening to the soft rustle of pine needles in the coastal wind, speaking two languages, and learning the deep wisdom of the forest from her mother Eleanor and her native guardians. Her legacy was not built of stone monuments or royal titles, but of living spirit, courage, and peaceful integration. Today, if you visit Roanoke Island on a quiet summer evening, the atmosphere is filled with a profound, peaceful stillness. The wooden reconstruction of Fort Raleigh stands surrounded by towering live oak trees draped in delicate grey Spanish moss. The gentle, warm ocean breeze blows through the pine branches, carrying the clean, sweet scent of cedar, salt marsh, and damp soil, the exact same scent that Arthur Barlow described in his logbook over 400 years ago. The waters of Pamlico Sound roll softly onto the sandy shoreline, their quiet, rhythmic crashing echoing like a timeless lullaby under a vast sky filled with brilliant, silent stars. As you stand along the shore, looking out across the dark water toward Hatteras Island, the noise of the modern world fades away completely. The ancient mystery loses its sharp edge of fear and sadness, leaving behind only a deep, comforting sense of peace and historical wonder. The dreamers, the brave mothers, the hard-working fathers, the playing children, and the wise native guides have all found their ultimate rest. Their long journey across stormy oceans and through wild forests is complete. They rest quietly in the gentle embrace of the land they came to love, their spirits woven forever into the silent woods, the rolling tides, and the whispering winds of Roanoke Island. Now, it is time for you to rest as well. Allow your mind to let go of every remaining thought, every lingering question, and every small worry of the day. Feel the profound, heavy stillness of the night, wrapping around you like a soft, warm blanket. Your body is completely relaxed, comfortable, and completely safe. Your breathing is slow, steady, and effortless, rising and falling in perfect, peaceful harmony with the soft, distant rhythm of the ocean waves. The stars shine quietly overhead, casting a soft, gentle light over the quiet waters and the ancient, resting forests of the world. Everything is calm. Everything is quiet. Everything is at peace. Let your eyelids grow heavier and heavier, sinking comfortably into the warm darkness. Allow yourself to drift effortlessly down into a deep, unbroken, and restful sleep, resting securely in the quiet, timeless embrace of the peaceful night.